Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange, often hilarious, final moments of those who were meant to be the most dignified figures on Earth royalty. Kings, queens, emperors. Their lives glittered with ceremony, velvet robes, and unimaginable wealth, but their deaths. Let's just say some of them might wish history had looked the other way. So before you get cozy, hit that like button and subscribe if you actually enjoyed this kind of storytelling. And tell me in the comments where you're rewatching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fun seeing this little community come together from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's tales. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. Death by desert of all the exits a king might take on the battlefield. Betrayed in court or on a deathbed, surrounded by wailing nobles, Adolf Fredrik of Sweden left this world thanks to desert. 'Twas a cold February night in 1771, and the king, like many of us, after a long day of doing, well, very little, decided to indulge. His feast began extravagantly. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and plenty of champagne, a tanner, but none of that killed him. What sealed his fate was dessert 14 portions of semla. For anyone unfamiliar, semla is a cardamom-scented wheat bun stuffed with almond paste, crowned with whipped cream, and often served in warm milk. Okay, one of these is enough to knock you into a food coma. Adolf Fredrik devoured 14. That's not indulgence's pastry-based self-destruction. His servants must have been panicking, quietly urging him to take a walk or put the spoon down. But the king pressed on, determined to finish. Later that evening, he doubled over with stomach cramps, collapsed, and officially died of digestive problems. In reality, quite literally ate himself to death. His reign was remembered for peace and minor reforms. But history gave him a different crown. The king who overdosed on dessert. Honestly, if you have to go, there are worse ways. King George II. The royal restroom exit royalty often imagined their passing with pomp, whispered Latin farewells, tearful courts, orchestras softly playing. King George II of Great Britain, he died on the toilet on October 25, 1760. The 76-year-old monarch woke up feeling unwell. Still, he went about his routines, some chatter, some grumbling, and finally, a trip to the privy. He never came back. Servants rushed in to find him slumped over the chamber pot, victim of a sudden aortic aneurysm. Yes, technically, he died of natural causes, but the setting was less than majestic. The King of England, defender of the faith, caught mid-business, trousers at half-mast. Not exactly portrait material. Now, to be fair, his toilet wasn't a humble bucket. It was fine porcelain, maybe trimmed in gold, and likely surrounded by attendants, doing their best not to look shocked. Okay, but still the story stuck. The official record politely cited a heart problem. Palace gossip, however, made sure we all knew the full truth. And so, George II went down in history, not just as a ruler of empires, but as the only British monarch remembered for dying on the toilet. Not the legacy anyone hopes for, but an unforgettable one nonetheless. Key, the mighty, killed by a dead man. Then we have deaths so strange they sound like bad fiction. Enter Sigurd, the mighty, a Viking Earl of Orkney in the 9th century. A brutal warrior, feared raider, and all-around Norse powerhouse. Sigurd was the kind of man who lived by the sword, conquering and terrorizing his neighbors. But his death, it came not from battle, betrayal, or plague bite from the teeth of someone already dead. And that, friends, is where things get truly bizarre. One day, Sigurd defeated his Scottish rival, a chieftain named Brit, in a display that screamed Viking bravado, mixed with questionable sanitation. He strapped a man's severed head to his saddle as a victory trophy. For Vikings, this wasn't unusual. It was gruesome, but standard practice. The problem? Brit's head still had teeth. As Sigurd rode home triumphantly, the grisly souvenir bounced around as decapitated heads tend to do when tied to saddles, and one of those teeth scratched his leg. It's just a small cut. It's nothing serious, unless you lived in the 9th century with no medicine, no antibiotics, and zero understanding of infection. His wound quickly festered, and before long, the mighty Viking lord was dead, taken down not by sword or spear, but by the bite of a corpse. That's not just ironic, that's comedy, straight out of the universe's cruelest script. Imagine being remembered as the warlord who conquered lands, slaughtered enemies, and then lost his life to a mouth that wasn't even alive anymore. History doesn't say whether his men laughed, cried, or just quietly untied the head and walked away. Probably a mix of all three. Sigurd's legend endures, not just for his victories, but because he may be the only Viking in history undone by post-mortem dentistry. Crown Prince Sito, death in a rice chest. Some royal deaths make you chuckle. Others make you push your food aside. The fate of Crown Prince Sito of Korea falls firmly in the second category. Born in the 18th century as heir to the host of the throne, Sito should have lived a privileged, gilded life. Instead, he became infamous as the prince who died inside a wooden chest, literally. By most accounts, Sito struggled with mood swings and paranoia. He executed servants on impulse and was said to wander the palace at night, sword in hand, muttering to himself. His father, King Yongjo, a strict and image-conscious ruler, saw his son's behavior as both dangerous and disgraceful, but outright execution of a crown prince would have been scandalous. So Yongjo found a compromise. In July hot, suffocating Korean summer, Sito was shut inside a giant rice chest normally used to store grain. No air, no water, no quick end. He lingered for 8 excruciating days before dying. The official records later claimed his death was an act of divine punishment, but let's be honest, the man was boxed to death. Ironically, Sito's son, King Jongjo, grew up to become one of Korea's greatest rulers. The rice chest incident was never openly discussed by the royal family, but history didn't forget. So the next time you complain about cramped spaces or stifling heat, spare a thought for Crown Prince Sito, whose family drama was literally solved with furniture. King Martin of Aragon, killed by laughter. We've all heard that laughter is good for you. King Martin of Aragon managed to prove that too much of it can be fatal. In 1410, near the end of his reign, Martin was bedridden with indigestion and severe flatulence. Courtiers were likely grateful for the distance. To cheer himself, the king summoned his jester and demanded a joke. When Martin asked why the jester had taken so long to appear, the fool answered, "Because I saw a young deer hanging from a fig tree by its tail, and I had to wonder if it was a sign from God." Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe delirium, or maybe it was just the funniest thing he'd heard in weeks. But Martin erupted in uncontrollable laughter. He laughed until his body gave out. Within moments, he collapsed and died. The official cause: indigestion and excessive laughter. The reality: a king who quite literally laughed himself. Yes, King Martin of Aragon literally laughed himself into the grave. There's something both pitiful and absurd about it. Kings are supposed to meet their end on the battlefield in palaces of marble, or at least while delivering a dramatic last line. Martin, he went out chuckling at a joke about a deer and a fig tree. His death triggered a succession crisis that threw the crown of Aragon into chaos. But behind the politics, no one could ignore the ridiculous circumstances. Imagine his advisors writing the report with straight faces. His Majesty has passed, while laughing uncontrollably. In time, Martin's bizarre demise became legend. Proof that yes, humor can kill. So laugh carefully, folks, especially on a full stomach. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, poisoned by immortality. If there was ever a ruler determined to dodge death, it was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He didn't just dream of eternal life, he demanded it. This was the man who standardized currency, measurements, and writing, built monumental roads and walls, and even created the famous terracotta army to guard him in the afterlife. But if you asked him, he wasn't planning on needing an afterlife anytime soon. Obsessed with immortality, Qin ordered his alchemists to concoct life-prolonging potions. Their answer: mercury pills. Yes, the same toxic substance that makes thermometers dangerous. Kini, silvery capsules that looked powerful but were essentially poison. The emperor swallowed them religiously, convinced he was sipping eternity. Instead, his body weakened, his mind unraveled, and on one of his secret tours, searching for more magical cures, he collapsed and died ironically from the very elixir meant to save him. His court, terrified of the fallout, kept his death a secret for days. To mask the stench of his decaying body, attendants reportedly hauled carts of rotting fish alongside the emperor's carriage. The man who feared death more than anything ended up fermenting next to seafood. His tomb still lies unopened, rumored to be surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury. Fitting, really. Qin Shi Huang wanted to last forever. And in a way, he has preserved, not as an immortal, but as a warning against quack science and glowing miracle pills. Pope John XII, a heavenly scandal. The papacy has seen plenty of drama wars, reforms, schisms, but few pontiffs ever reached the chaotic heights of Pope John XII. Born Octavianus, he became pope in 955 AD at the age of 18, too young, too reckless, and quickly notorious. His papal court looked less like a holy center of Christendom and more like a wild Roman house party. He gambled, drank, toasted the devil during Mass, and was rumored to bless mistresses as easily as he blessed bishops. So it's not surprising his death was equally scandalous. According to chroniclers, John XII died of a stroke, but not during prayer or service while in bed with a married woman. The head of the Catholic Church supposedly met his end mid-affair. The Vatican never confirmed the story, perhaps to save face, but the tale spread and stuck. Whether fact or smear campaign, the image of a pope dying mid-sin was too sensational to vanish. He reigned less than a decade, but managed to blur nearly every line between sacred and profane. History remembers him not just for how he lived, but how spectacularly he ignored his job description. He came, he sinned, he collapsed, and history never let go. King Alexander of Greece, monkey business royalty faced many dangers, assassins, wars, poisons, but King Alexander of Greece. He was taken down by a monkey. It was 1920, and Greece was teetering on political unrest. Alexander was a young king, more a stand-in than a true ruler, holding the throne while his father lived in exile. But his reign ended in one of the strangest royal deaths ever recorded. One afternoon, strolling through the palace gardens with his dog, Alexander came across a pet Barbary macaque coned by a palace worker. These monkeys are small, but notorious for bad tempers. Naturally, the dog and monkey clashed. When Alexander tried to separate them, another monkey suddenly jumped in. And that's when the chaos really began. The two monkeys, not exactly thrilled with royal interference, turned their fury on Alexander and bit his legs again and again. At first, the injuries seemed minor. The king was patched up and sent on his way. Nothing alarming. But infection soon crept in, then gangrene, and finally sepsis. Within 3 weeks, Greece's monarch was dead, taken down by monkeys. The aftermath was enormous. His sudden death sparked a constitutional crisis, brought his exiled father back to the throne, and tipped Greece deeper into political chaos. All thanks to a monkey fight. Newspapers of the time struggled with the story. Killed by monkeys didn't exactly fit the royal obituary-style guide. They softened it into phrases like an unfortunate accident or sudden illness, but the truth leaked out anyway. Alexander's reign may have been short and largely uneventful, but his death guaranteed him a permanent place in bizarre trivia. The only king killed by primates, whose names history never bothered to record. King Charles II of Navarre, death by candle. When you think of medieval kings dying, you picture swords, poison, or at least a dramatic collapse at a feast. Charles II of Navarre, better known as Charles the Bad Yes, that was his official title, managed to go out in a way both absurd and highly flammable. By the late 14th century, Charles was in poor health, possibly from years of treachery, scheming, and general nastiness. His doctors, armed with the razor-sharp medical knowledge of the Middle Ages, meaning none at all, devised a treatment. They wrapped him from head to toe in linen soaked with brandy. Essentially, they slow-cooked him in liquor. The king was sewn into this boozy cocoon and left to rest, with one servant assigned to cut the final stitch. Unfortunately, the servant was working by candlelight. One slip, one brush of flame against alcohol-soaked linen, and Charles ignited like a torch. Panic, erupted screams, chaos, nobles fainting in hallways, but the damage was done. Charles II, a man who spent his life burning others with betrayal, was himself consumed by fire thanks to bad bedside care. The cruel irony was unmistakable. A king feared for his ruthlessness died like a torch in a wine cellar. Moral of the story: if your nickname is already the Bad, don't add fire hazards to your medical treatments. King Edmund II, death in the privy. Some kings go out in battle, others in bed, surrounded by mourners. Edmund II of England, he's rumored to have met his end on the toilet. Edmund, nicknamed Ironside for his grit on the battlefield, ruled for only 7 months in 1016. He earned his name fighting off Danish invaders led by Canute the Great. Defeated, betrayed, constantly under threat, Edmund was every bit the hardened Anglo-Saxon warrior king. But his death, according to one enduring and highly suspicious medieval rumor, was far less glorious. While relieving himself in the privy, an assassin supposedly hid beneath the wooden seat. As the king sat down, the killer struck upward with a dagger. Gruesome, absolutely. Heroic, not at all. The warrior who fought like steel on the battlefield may have fallen in the least dignified position possible. The historical record isn't exactly clear. Some chronicles claim Edmund died from injuries sustained in battle. Others hint at a private betrayal. But a few storytellers, armed with more imagination than evidence, paint a vivid picture of a murderer lurking beneath the privy, waiting to stab upward at the king's most vulnerable moment. It reads more like political smear than sober history, yet the tale endured. After all, nothing tarnishes a warrior's reputation quite like being slain on the toilet. Picture it: Edmund, perhaps humming a victory tune after a grueling campaign, finally sitting down for a moment of peace only to be struck from below. It's hardly the kind of scene destined for stained glass windows, more like pub gossip fodder for centuries. And yet, if the rumor holds any truth, it was undeniably clever. A ruler is never more exposed than while on the privy. No armor, no blade, no guards, just linen, gravity, and misplaced faith in Anglo-Saxon sanitation. So whether the story is fact, fabrication, or something in between, Edmund Ironside's strange demise serves as a reminder. Even the toughest monarchs have weak points, especially when seated. King Henry I. Too many lampreys when it comes to kings overeating themselves into the grave. Henry I of England wins the crown in 1135 after 30 years of ruling, warring, and outmaneuvering barons. His undoing came not on the battlefield, but at the dinner table with a heap of lampreys. Lampreys, in case you've been spared the sight, are ill-like. Jawless fish with circular mouths full of teeth, a culinary nightmare that medieval nobles treated as a luxury. To Henry, they were an obsession. He devoured them constantly, even against the advice of his doctors, who warned that lampreys were dangerously heavy food. But kings weren't known for moderation, and Henry scoffed at their concerns while visiting Normandy. Okay, He indulged in a massive helping of the slimy creatures, likely boiled and piled on a plate with a little ceremony. Soon after, he collapsed with stomach pains, fever, and vomiting. Within days, the king was dead of what we now call food poisoning. His embalmed body was shipped back to England in the winter chill, with grim details of the journey better left unspoken. He had been a skilled, often ruthless ruler, but his reign ended with a grotesque meal. Reportedly, when his physicians begged him to give up lampreys, Henry laughed and declared, "I'd rather die than stop eating them." And, indeed, he did. King James II of Scotland, killed by his own cannon, many monarchs perished in battle. Others succumbed to disease. James II of Scotland, however, holds the dubious honor of dying by standing too close to his own artillery. It was 1460. James, just 29, was fiery-tempered and famously obsessed with cannons. At the siege of Roxburgh Castle, still in English hands, he wanted to showcase his cutting-edge firepower, And of course, he insisted on watching the action up close. As the massive gun was fired, it exploded catastrophically. A chunk of metal tore through the king, killing him almost instantly. Witnesses scattered in shock. After all, it's not every day the commander-in-chief literally detonates. Though stunned, the Scottish forces regrouped, seized the castle, and even renamed it James's Castle in his memory, whether as tribute or dark joke, history doesn't say. The bitter irony. James had championed Scotland's modernization of artillery, delighting in the noise and smoke. What he didn't appreciate was basic safety distance. Today, he's remembered not for his political achievements, but for being one of the few rulers in history blown apart by his own enthusiasm. Emperor Elagabalus, too strange to last. If the Roman Empire ever needed a warning label for excess, it would be Emperor Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianissa, name that already sounds like a spell from a wizard. Esbuki rose to the throne in 218 CE at just 14 years old, a teenage emperor with unlimited resources, limitless power, and zero restraint was always going to be trouble. His short reign became infamous for eccentricity, scandal, and behavior so bizarre that later historians struggled to decide if he was a visionary, a madman, or both. Elagabalus didn't just bend Rome's rules, he shattered them and turned the shards into jewelry. He famously appointed a horse to an official post, demanded to be addressed as empress rather than emperor, and once hosted a feast where so many rose petals rained down on guests that some suffocated. His private life was just as turbulent. He reportedly married 5 times, including once to a Vestal Virgin. Direct violation of Roman land, became notorious for dressing in women's clothes, wearing makeup, and offering rewards to doctors who could surgically transform him into a woman. Today, we might describe him as gender nonconforming or fluid. In ancient Rome, it made him a scandal wrapped in silk. Yet it wasn't he, his wardrobe, or wild behavior that doomed him. It was his assault on Roman religion. He attempted to dethrone Jupiter, chief of the gods, and replace him with Elagabal, a Syrian sun deity. He even erected a huge temple in the capital and forced senators to watch as he performed dances around a sacred black stone. By 222 CE, Rome's Praetorian Guard, the empire's bodyguards, with more blades than loyalty, had seen enough. They killed Elagabalus and his mother, dragged their corpses through the streets, and tossed them into the Tiber River. He was only 18, a teenager with limitless power, endless indulgence, and no self-control. Historians still argue whether he was a visionary ahead of his time or simply a chaotic storm in a jeweled robe. What's certain is this: Rome found him far too bizarre to survive. Catherine the Great, the rumor that wouldn't die. Few monarchs left behind legacies as sweeping gore, as clouded by scandal as Catherine the Great of Russia. She was a sharp reformer, a patron of the arts, and a commanding ruler who expanded Russia's borders and exchanged letters with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire. Yet, mention her name at dinner and someone will inevitably whisper about a horse. Let's settle this once and for all. No, Catherine did not perish in some obscene encounter with the stallion. The myth, ridiculous and cruel, was fabricated by her enemies after her death. It has no historical foundation whatsoever, says more about 18th century slander than about Catherine herself. In truth, she died of a stroke in 1796 at the age of 67, collapsing in her chambers while using the toilet. Quiet, undramatic, and very human. So, where did the horror story come from? Catherine, as a woman ruling a male-dominated empire, made powerful adversaries. She was unapologetically brilliant, politically ruthless, and openly passionate in her personal life. Like kings, whose mistresses were celebrated, Catherine's lovers became ammunition for gossip. After her death, rivals seized the chance to smear her memory. The horse rumor, crude and unforgettable, stuck like a malicious headline. So despite dragging Russia into the Enlightenment and reshaping its empire, she's forever linked to a lie. Catherine did not die with spectacle or scandal. She died quietly. But history, ever hungry for gossip, denied her dignity. The lesson: power fades, but rumors, especially outrageous ones, can gallop through centuries. Emperor Valentinian II. The unsolved bathtub mystery. Most royal deaths come with an explanation: lost battle, disease, or maybe an over-eager feast of lampreys. But the end of Emperor Valentinian II remains an unsolved puzzle that has lingered for over 1,600 years. The year was 392 CE. Valentinian was just 21, but he had technically been emperor since age 4, hardly the resume Rome needed. But such was imperial succession. Like most child rulers, he wasn't really in charge. That role fell to a general named Arbogast. And Arbogast wasn't exactly subtle. He wielded real authority, while the young emperor served as a figurehead. Eventually, Valentinian grew tired of being little more than a puppet. He began to resist. Not long after, his body was discovered in his residence at Vienne lifeless in a bathtub. Officially, his death was declared a suicide. Yet, many suspected foul play. Arbogast conveniently remained in power afterward, insisting his hands were clean. Historians still debate. Did the emperor truly end his own life, or was he drowned to remove a nuisance? All we know for sure is that Valentinian's death left the empire rattled and his bathtub mystery unsolved. Whispers of politics thickened into threats. The palace seemed heavy with the scent of accidental deaths waiting to happen. And then, one morning, Valentinian was discovered, lifeless in his bath, not slain in battle, not stabbed in the Senate, but quietly drowned in a tub. No stab wounds, no bruises, just a young emperor drifting like the closing chapter of a poorly crafted mystery. Arbogast, of course, insisted it was suicide. A neat, convenient explanation. But historians have doubted that tale for centuries. Valentinian was young, ambitious, and only just beginning to assert himself. Suicide, unconvincing. Assassination. Now that fits Rome's style. Still, with no witnesses and with cause of death back then, meaning little more than he's not breathing, nothing could ever be proven. What followed was chaos. The Western Empire plunged into instability as Arbogast propped up a puppet emperor, sparking yet another civil war. All this set off by a body in a bathtub and 100 unanswered questions. Valentinian II's death may not have been the bloodiest or strangest on record, but it stands out for its suspicious silence. Because if history has one lesson, it's this: emperors who drown in bathtubs rarely drown alone. In the sunlit city of Argos, where marble temples gleamed and sea winds tangled with the smell of olives, a fragile girl named Telesilla was born to a life of quiet expectations. Her family was wealthy, cultured, and well-placed, but their daughter was considered too weak, too frail, to leave a real mark on the world. From an early age, Telesilla battled constant illness. We dain't know what afflicted her. Ancient records rarely offer such clarity, but she spent much of her youth bedridden, more spectator than participant in life. In a society that valued strength, public presence, and athleticism, her fragility could have confined her to obscurity. But fate, or perhaps the muses, intervened. Cut off from the bustle of the agora and the festivals of Hera, she turned inward. There, she discovered poetry. Words became her companions, rhythm her lifeline. Rather than surrender to despair, she wrote verses with a fluency others might reserve for breath. Her poetry honored Apollo, Artemis, and Athena, gods of healing, wisdom, and war, fitting considering what awaited her future. As her devotion grew, so did her strength. Pausanias, the ancient travel writer, claimed that her dedication to poetry and the divine restored her health. Whether through ritual practice, spiritual renewal, or sheer willpower, she slowly transformed no longer just a fragile girl, but a poetess with resilience and voice. Her hymns began to spread, recited at temples, sung at festivals. Her verses gave Argive women something rare, identity and belonging in a world dominated by men. Her words weren't just piety, they were empowerment, reminding women they were woven into the fabric of the divine story. Through poetry, Telesilla gave Argos its voice. And though no one yet knew it, that voice would soon move beyond temples and into war. For Argos had grown complacent, lulled by past glory, while Sparta, its eternal rival, sharpened its blades. While the men of Argos argued and hesitated, no one imagined that a poeta, once frail girl who had healed herself with words, would become the heartbeat of their resistance. In truth, Telesilla had been preparing them all along. Hymns were more than devotion. They were discipline. They were rehearsals for something louder, sharper, and far more dangerous. When the time came, the women of Argos already knew how to find the rhythm of defiance, because she had taught them how to sing it. The year was around 494 BCE. Argos stood on the edge of ruin. Tensions with Sparta snapped, and the Battle of Sciopia erupted. The Argive army, proud in its numbers and tradition, marched straight into a trap sprung by King Cleomenes of Sparta. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The Spartans cut them down with precision, turning confidence into catastrophe. Some say nearly the entire male force of Argos was annihilated. What remained was a hollowed city, walls undefended, gates exposed, its fate all but sealed. Sparta believed the conquest was already theirs. What Cleomenes didn't realize, what perhaps no one could have foreseen, was that behind those morning walls, Alas Telesilla, when grief might have drowned the city, when surrender seemed the only choice, she stepped forward, not with armor or crown, but with fire in her voice. She called the women of Argos together, widows, mothers, daughters, even the elderly and servants. They scavenged weapon spears left on racks, shields abandoned by the fallen, stones pried from the earth, even farming tools repurposed into blades. Telesilla turned despair into an army. She organized, drilled, and strategized. Women lined the battlements to create the illusion of a fully manned defense. Others trained in formation, clumsy but determined. They weren't soldiers, but they were furious, and fury has always been its own kind of weapon. And then Argos waited. The Spartans would return. Everyone knew it. But when they came, expecting an easy conquest, they did not find a broken city. They found walls bristling with women, weapons in hand, eyes locked and steady. At their head stood Telesilla, a queen, not a general, but a poet who had turned grief into steel. The Spartans advanced, and the women attacked. It was not the clean, heroic warfare of hoplite formations. It was brutal, chaotic, and intimate. Spears stabbed down from towers. Boiling water and stones rained from above. Blades hacked in alleys. Every corner of Argos became a battlefield. The Spartans' disciplined killers were suddenly forced into savage, close-quarters combat with women they had never been trained to fight. That hesitation, that moment of disbelief, cost them dearly. Pausanias, centuries later, would record that Telesilla's militia drove the Spartans back. And improbable as it sounds, context makes it believable. Sparta had already achieved its main objective, the destruction of Argos' army. To linger, to risk losing men to a citizen force led by women, was not just dangerous, it was humiliating. And for Sparta, humiliation was intolerable, so they withdrew. Think about that. Portus, once bedridden, dismissed as fragile, had rallied grieving women into warriors and saved her city. This was no legend dressed in myth. It was recorded history. The victory was more than survival. It was a declaration. It rewrote the boundaries of courage, of leadership, of womanhood itself. That day, Argos did not fall. It stood taller than before, lifted by hands that had once held only lyres and woven cloth. And at the center of it all was Telesilla, the poet who gave her city not just its second breath, but a legacy that outlived Sparta's swords. She never claimed power. She never crowned herself queen or reached for a throne. When the danger had passed, Telesilla simply returned to her poetry. To some, that might seem anticlimactic. In truth, it was her brilliance. She hadn't fought for glory or ambition. She had fought because Argos needed her, and once the city was safe, she returned to the craft that first healed her, composing hymns, honoring the gods. But her verses were no longer the same. They carried new weight, not just festival songs, but living memories set to rhythm. Imagine the young girls of Argos growing up in the shadow of her defense, whispering stories of the poet who once became a general, of mothers who once became warriors. Imagine them reciting her hymns under the moonlight, not as ritual alone, but as power. Poetry had become prophecy, and prophecy had become precedent. Her city honored her not just in song, but in stone. In the temple of Aphrodite, a statue was raised. Telesilla seated calmly, scrolls at her feet, one hand on her lyre, the other resting on a shield. Not a contradiction, but a complete truth. She was both artist and defender, and she had shown Argos that these roles did not weaken each other, they belonged together. Beyond Argos, her story spread. She became a symbol not only of Argive resilience, but of womanly courage in a world that rarely allowed such stories to breathe. Philosophers debated her, poets echoed her, and later writers preserved her name among lists of heroic women queens, oracles, and warriors. And yet, her greatest statement may have been her silence. She did not seek more battles. She did not chase fame. She returned to ink and rhythm, to the sacred private space where poems are born. In that, she proved that real strength is not measured by how long you wield a sword, but by knowing when to lay it down. Her reputation grew, not by conquest, but by admiration. Men spoke of her in symposiums with a kind of reverent surprise. She was not deified into a goddess. She remained human, and that made her all the more powerful. Her dual legacy resonated because it broke a mold no one thought could be broken. In an age when women were expected to be silent, invisible, ornamental, Telesilla was none of those things. She was educated, expressive, and when the moment came, unflinching. Even her words did not vanish entirely. Fragments survive, cited by grammarians centuries later, verses of reverence, divine invocation, vivid imagery. They remind us that she was not only writing poetry, she was shaping the sacred. Much has been lost, but what remains is enough. Enough to prove she believed in beauty and community, in the power of language to summon not only worship, but courage. Later artists depicted her surrounded by scrolls and shields, sometimes crowned with laurel, sometimes sitting in quiet contemplation, always poised between song and silence, art and action, always a reminder. Through the Hellenistic age and even into Roman times, her name appeared in anthologies. a rare intrusion of a woman's voice into lists dominated by men. She was not repeated for novelty. She was remembered because she mattered. Telesilla of Argos was never the loudest warrior, nor the most prolific poet. She was rare, someone who moved between two worlds with grace, fire, and intent. And though centuries dimmed her name, tucking her into the margins of history, her story still lingers, not as accident, not as anomaly, but as proof that a woman could stand as poet and protector, that strength could be measured in clarity, and that courage could be carried in verse as surely as in steel. Remarkable. The Hellenistic world, with its shifting power centers and cultural transformations, began favoring different kinds of heroes, conquerors, philosophers, kings. In this new climate, a woman poet who defended her city with wit and will didn't quite fit the mold of the stories that empires like to tell. By the time Roman authors picked up her name, it was almost folkloric. Plutarch mentions her with a kind of rhetorical curiosity, less interested in her verse or her politics, and more in the idea that a woman had ever wielded command at all. To him and many of his contemporaries, Tales was an anomaly, a remarkable exception, a rare flower in a man's garden. But this is where history itself betrays us, because it wasn't just Telesilla who vanished from the center of the narrative. It was countless women like her, leaders, thinkers, poets, whose stories were deemed too inconvenient to preserve in full. The scrolls were lost. The statues were repurposed or destroyed. The voices were silenced, not by violence, but by centuries of editorial neglect. And yet, Tila persisted. Her story survived, not because it was allowed to, but because it was too compelling to kill. Because the image of a woman standing atop a city wall, shield in one hand, verse in the other, simply refused to go quietly. That kind of image doesn't disappear, smolders in memory, reignites in times of crisis, whispers to each new generation that bravery wears many faces, and some of them wear veils. In modern times, historians and feminists alike have begun to revisit her legacy, not to exaggerate it, but to reclaim it, to dust off the silence and examine what happens when we let the full weight of a woman's story stand beside her male counterparts. And in doing so, we don't just remember Telechilla, we remember what history tried to forget. Though much of ancient Greece has crumbled, its statues worn smooth, its scrolls turned to dust, Tella's legacy still lingers in three enduring forms: stone, scroll, and sisterhood. First, the stone. In the ancient sanctuary of Aphrodisian Argos, long after the war cries faded, the statue of Telechilla once stood. Not a grand marble colossus, but a thoughtful monument. She was depicted seated calmly, her scrolls scattered at her feet, her hand resting on a helmet. No raised sword, no dramatic stance, just a moment of stillness, an image of a woman who had mastered both art and action. Even the placement in Aphrodite's temple was deliberate. Not Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom. Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and, perhaps here, resilience. It was a quiet revolution, carved in stone. Then came the scrolls. Though most of Tels's poetry is lost, what little remains reveals a voice rich with reverence and clarity. Scholars across centuries have tried to piece together her verses, finding in them not only artistic merit, but emotional insight. Her style belonged to the lyric tradition, intimate, melodic, charged with spiritual devotion. She was not writing for spectacle, she was writing for the soul. And perhaps that's why her words survived longer than her battles. And finally, the sisterhood. Tels's story became a kind of coded anthem for women through the ages, especially for those denied swords, votes, or recognition. She offered something more enduring than strategy: permission. Permission to act, to speak, to lead, to protect. She wasn't just a historical figure. She was a mirror, one in which generations of women could see their own potential reflected, no matter how obscured by time. Okay? Her tale has inspired plays, poems, even academic treatises, I should say. In feminist readings of ancient history, she is no longer a footnote. She is a cornerstone, a reminder that when institutions fall silent, individuals can still shout. That when history closes a door, memory opens a window. In classrooms, in books, in whispered conversations, among those hungry for forgotten heroines, Tales lives on. She is the patron saint of the underestimated. It's the poet who chose not only to sing of heroes, but to become one. Tila never asked to be remembered. She didn't command monuments or beg for her name to be etched in history. And yet, here we are, over 2,000 years later, still speaking her name, still telling her story, still aided by what she did in a world that tried to forget her kind. What makes her legacy so compelling is not just that she fought or that she wrote, but that she did both when neither was expected nor allowed of someone like her. A sickly girl with a lyre was never supposed to lead a militia. A woman who composed hymns wasn't meant to rewrite the fate of a city, but she did, and not through divine intervention or noble birth, but through clarity, purpose, and grit. In the grand tapestry of Greek history, full of heroes with bronze muscles and flowing capes, Tales stands apart. She doesn't roar like Achilles or scheme like Odysseus. She does something far harder. She holds the line. She looks into the face of collapse, and she does not flinch. Not because she was fearless, but because someone had to act and no one else did. And that's what makes her echo last. She reminds us that heroism doesn't always come with a trumpet blast or a poet's blessing. Sometimes it comes in the form of a woman who picks up a sword with shaking hands, steadies herself, and says, "Not today." Today, scholars and creatives alike continue to draw inspiration from her. Her story is taught in feminist studies, referenced in discussions about women in warfare, and even invoked in debates about the fluidity of roles across gender and class. She has become not just a symbol of Argos, but of resistance itself. And if you listen carefully, her voice still hums beneath the surface of modern tales. In every woman who steps up when others step back, in every artist who refuses to stay in their lane, in every act of courage that begins with a whisper and ends in thunder. Tales' legacy is not locked in the past. It is alive, breathing, moving quietly through the world. Because the truth is, the lyre was never put down. It was simply transformed into something sharper. 4 arches, before blueprints, before even the ideal of architecture. There was a simple human need to get from one side to the other, cross rushing rivers, deep ravines, and perilous chasms. The early ancestors of humanity faced a question as old as travel itself. How do you cross when the land disappears? The very first bridges were not built by engineers. They were stumbled upon by wanderers and hunters who noticed a fallen tree spanning a stream or watched vines drape across a gorge. These early crossings weren't planned, they were found. Nature gave the hint, and humans took the cue. A fallen log, a line of stones, placed just right. This was where bridges were born. Out of curiosity, out of fear, out of hunger. Over time, those accidental crossings became intentional. In rainforests, people began binding together vines and reeds to form hanging footpaths. These weren't exactly stable. You wouldn't want to cross one in the dark, but they were a beginning, a literal lifeline between food and famine, isolation and community. In parts of what is now South America, early civilizations began using twisted plant fibers to create longer, suspended crossings. These weren't just primitive ropes. They were woven, reinforced, and tested with centuries of refinement. The Incor, long before the Spanish conquest, perfected the art of the rope bridge. But even before the Inca Empire, the peoples of the Andes were mastering techniques that required deep understanding of tension, weight distribution, and natural materials. What makes these early bridges remarkable is not their size, but their boldness. Imagine looking at a river gorge hundreds of feet deep, and instead of walking away, you begin tying grass together. That's not just ingenuity. It's a kind of bravery wrapped in necessity. These first crossings changed more than routes. They changed relationships. Once two valleys were linked, ideas flowed as easily as people. Trade routes emerged. Languages mingled. Cultural exchange was born on shaky ropes and damp planks. A bridge, even the humblest one, is always more than wood and fiber. It's an invitation, a statement, a quiet refusal to let nature have the final say. In those earliest spans, civilizations took their first steps toward connection and never looked back. High in the Andes Mountains, where cliffs drop like knives and rivers roar with glacier melt, the Inca Empire wove its own answer to nature's brutal geography. The Incas didn't just build bridges, they tied the sky together. Their roads ran for thousands of miles across mountains and valleys. But it was the rope bridges, or Quishuachica, that truly defied imagination. These bridges were made entirely of grass. Not wood, not metal, not stone, just woven strands of ichu, a tough mountain grass twisted into cords, and those cords twisted into cables. The process wasn't just technical, it was ceremonial. Entire villages would gather once a year to build or rebuild these bridges by hand. Each family was responsible for a section of rope. They braided, chanted, and hauled, working in a rhythm passed down through generations. The resulting bridge could stretch across a 100-foot canyon, swaying with every gust of mountain wind. No nails, no bolts, just pure tension and trust. And yet these rope bridges were strong enough to support llamas, soldiers, messengers, and traders. They were the beating arteries of an empire, spanning canyons where no stone could be placed. And they were elegant in their own way, suspended like cobwebs across the void. They moved with the wind instead of fighting it. They bent, swayed, and sighed, but rarely broke. When one did collapse, it wasn't treated as a failure. It was simply the end of a cycle, ready to be born again by the hands of those who lived along its path. These rope bridges weren't just infrastructure. They were sacred. The annual rebuilding was a living ritual, a reminder that the land was not to be conquered, but worked with. That connection required not brute force, but harmony. No empire understood this better than the Angkor. Even today, one rope bridge remains in use. The last Quishuaca, still rebuilt annually by local communities near Hanare, Peru. SCO has recognized it as intangible cultural heritage. Tourists cross it gingerly. Locals cross it with muscle memory. In a world that increasingly forgets how to repair, the Inca Bridge reminds us of something ancient and vital. That strength doesn't always come from stone. Sometimes it comes from woven grass, shared labor, and the will to meet across the void. Far from the wind-tossed Andes across the rivers of ancient China, another philosophy of bridge building was taking root, one that favored permanence over flexibility, symmetry over sway. Chinese engineers saw bridges not just as tools, but as expressions of balance of earth, water, and heaven connected in stone. As early as the Zhou dynasty, Chinese builders had been experimenting with wooden and pontoon bridges. But it was during the Han and later the Sui and Tang dynasties that something extraordinary emerged: the segmental arch bridge. Unlike the steep Roman arch, which relied on a high curve, the Chinese approach flattened the arch, giving their bridges a gentle rise and greater stability under dynamic loads like carts and animals. These were not just aesthetic choices, they were masterclasses in tension and compression. Take, for example, the Zhao Bridge, built in the early 7th century by the engineer Li Chen. Spanning 123 feet with a 37-foot high arch, It remains one of the oldest surviving open spandrel stone bridges in the world. It's not just old, it's brilliant. Li Qin designed it with smaller secondary arches along the base to reduce weight and water resistance during floods. His understanding of both structure and natural forces was centuries ahead of his time. But Chinese bridges weren't only feats of engineering, they were deeply poetic. Many were built near temples or gardens, reflecting ideals of Taoist harmony and Confucian order. The bridge wasn't just a crossing, okay? It was a moment, a pause between destinations, a chance to contemplate the still water below and the swirling heavens above. Okay. Stone lions often guarded the entrances, not merely as decoration, but as symbols of protection. Bridge names were chosen with care, often invoking luck, longevity, or spiritual awakening. And for scholars and artists of the Temps and Song dynasties, bridges became a favorite subject in painting and verse. A simple walk across one could become a metaphor for everything. It's change, connection, and the quiet strength of staying still amid motion. In ancient China, bridges were more than civil works. They were spiritual geometry. Each stone laid not just with skill, but with philosophy. To cross one wasn't just to travel, it was to pass through balance itself. China built with harmony, Rome built with ambition. For the Romans, a bridge wasn't just a way to cross a river. It was a declaration, we're here and we will stay. As the Roman Empire expanded, it faced an endless parade of rivers, valleys, and gorges. But where others saw obstacles, Rome saw blueprints. The Romans took what the Etruscans had started, arch technology, and turned it into something monumental and permanent, using stone, concrete, and sheer willpower. Roman engineers constructed bridges that didn't just survive time, they defined it. One of the most famous is the Pons Vergesius, built in 62 BCE, which still carries foot traffic across the Tiber River today. That's more than 2 millennia of wear and war, flood and footstep, and still standing. The genius of the Roman bridge lay in its arch. A Roman arch distributed weight evenly, channeling force into the ground. It allowed bridges to span wider rivers and support heavier loads. And with the invention of patella concrete, which could set underwater, Roman builders gained flexibility their rivals couldn't match. But function was never enough for Rome. These bridges were built with grandeur. They were often faced with marble or limestone inscribed with the names of emperors adorned with statues and triumphal messages. Some were even designed as part of aqueducts, like the breathtaking Pont Gard in modern-day France, which served as both a water channel and a towering architectural statement. For Roman legions, bridges meant speed. For Roman merchants, they meant prosperity. And for the empire itself, they meant permanence. The roads of Rome were famously straight and unyielding, but it was the bridges that made those roads matter. Wherever Rome went, it bridged the gap, literally and metaphorically, between conquest and civilization. A bridge wasn't just infrastructure, it was empire in miniature, orderly, strong, and built to last. Even after the empire fell, many Roman bridges remained, used, rebuilt, reimagined. The stones whispered of a time when engineers walked hand in hand with emperors and won rivers, no matter how wide or wild, bowed to the Roman will. To cross a Roman bridge was to walk in the footsteps of conquerors and to feel the weight of eternity under your feet. While Rome built in stone and China in symmetry, ancient India quietly cultivated a bridge tradition that was unlike anything else on earth. Bridges made from trees, not cut wood, not rope, not carved beams, living, growing trees. In the wet, hilly region of Meghalaya in the northeast of the Indian subcontinent, rivers are fed by relentless monsoons. Flash floods sweep away bamboo, rope, and timber bridges with ease. But centuries ago, the Kharsi and Jancha peoples found a way to use nature not as an obstacle, but as a partner. They began guiding the roots of the FC elastica tree, a type of rubber fig, across streams and rivers, slowly, patiently. It's over years, then decades. The roots were trained using hollowed-out tree trunks, scaffolding, and bamboo frames to grow toward the opposite bank. When the roots met, they were woven and anchored into the soil, creating a bridge that was quite literally alive. These living root bridges didn't rot. They didn't splinter. In fact, they grew stronger with age. A young bridge might take 15 years to become usable. But once mature, it could last hundreds of years, sustained by the very land it stood on. This was not fast architecture, it was generational. Grandfather would begin weaving a bridge that his grandchildren might one day walk across. There was no blueprint, only tradition, no calculation, only intuition, passed down through watching, doing, and remembering. And these bridges weren't just functional, they were breathtaking, suspended among waterfalls and emerald valleys. It's the root. Bridges curved and twisted like something from a fairy tale, organic and surreal, blending into the jungle as if grown by myth. In a world that often values speed, India's living bridges are a defiant, slow song. They show that time, care, and cooperation with nature can produce wonders just as lasting as stone. They are community projects, sacred paths, a reminder that not all strength is rigid. Some of it is woven, flexible, and alive. To cross a root bridge is to cross into a different rhythm of civilization, one that listens to the earth rather than reshaping it. And in that quiet balance, India bridged. More than rivers, it bridged the wild itself, cool in the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved ribbons through desert and city. Early Mesopotamians faced a familiar problem, rivers that both nourished and separated. These waterways brought trade, irrigation, and life, but they also created boundaries. And where boundaries exist, someone eventually builds a bridge. Unlike the later empires of stone and steel, ancient Mesopotamians worked with what they had: mud, brick, timber, and ingenuity. Their rivers were broad, but not bottomless. Their materials were fragile, but their minds were not. The city of Babylon, one of the jewels of ancient Mesopotamia, is famously divided by the Euphrates River, but it was also famously connected. So Greek historian Herodotus claimed that Babylon had an early movable bridge constructed of wooden planks laid across boats and tied together with papyrus ropes. By day, it fied people in carts. By night, it was dismantled to prevent enemy access. Whether this account is precise or poetic, it reflects a truth. Mesopotamian cities were not isolated settlements. They were logistical masterpieces. Bridges here were not just structures, they were strategies. Some were built low and temporary, designed to be rebuilt after floods. Others were made with baked bricks and asphalt mortars, resting on foundations driven deep into silt and clay. Mesopotamians understood the river's moods. They didn't try to conquer water with brute force. They tried to work around it, above it, and sometimes even under it. Trade caravans carrying grain, textiles, and lapis lazuli needed bridges. Temples and ziggurats drew pilgrims from opposite shores, and kings, forever in need of control, understood that whoever held the bridge controlled the city. Over time, as empires like the Assyrians and Persians rose, their bridges grew in complexity. Engineers began incorporating stone piers and more permanent wooden spans. But the roots of that engineering went back to the simplest acts: bundling reeds, piling clay, stretching logs. The logic of bridging, the why, came long before the how. Mesopotamian bridges may not have survived the centuries like Rome's or inspired poetry like China's, but they formed a vital foundation. They were among the first expressions of infrastructure, the bones of organized society. They taught us that where there is commerce, there must be connection. And where there is water, someone will always try to walk across it. To the ancient Greeks, the world was not just a place to live. It was a canvas to be shaped, measured, and perfected. And when it came to bridges, they brought the same thoughtful attention to proportion, harmony, and engineering that they poured into their temples and sculptures. Unlike the Romans, the Greeks weren't obsessed with spanning vast distances or showcasing imperial power. Their bridges were often more modest, but no less intelligent, built across small rivers, marshes, or rocky gaps. These structures were crafted with an elegant balance of form and function. Okay? Take the Artico Bridge, located in the Peloponnese, dating back to the Bronze Age, around 1500 BCE. It's one of the oldest surviving arch bridges in the world. Built of large, unmortared limestone boulders, the bridge still stands today, quietly carrying foot traffic as it did millennia ago. There are no inscriptions, no imperial eagles, no towering arches, just a single, subtle span, built with precision and enduring grace. The Greeks understood stone. They understood load-bearing. And perhaps, most importantly, they understood the importance of community connectivity. Many of their early roads and bridges were part of sacred routes, used during religious festivals and processions to temples such as the Long Journey to Delhi or Olympia. In these contexts, a bridge wasn't just about moving people, it was about guiding them toward the divine. Later, during the classical and Hellenistic periods, Greek cities began incorporating more advanced engineering methods, borrowing and adapting Etruscan and Eastern techniques. Timber and stone were used together. Some bridges even included drainage systems, careful grading, and guardrails. Still, aesthetics mattered. A Greek bridge didn't just serve a function, it fit into the landscape, enhancing rather than dominating it. It was common to find bridges positioned for viewing, often offering perfect symmetry with the surrounding hills and sky, water below, air above, and stone in between. The Greeks liked their elements. These figures suggest not only communal celebration, but choreographed percussive culture. The drum wasn't just entertainment, it was expression. Later, as Vedic civilization emerged and Sanskrit texts began to form, the musical tradition of the Indian subcontinent would explode into complexity. But its seeds, those silent ceramic flutes of the Indus, had already taken root. Over time, music in India became inseparable from spiritual practice. The Vedas, the sacred Hindu texts, were chanted and highly regulated. Melodic patterns, called sama. These weren't songs as we know them, okay? They were sound formulas intended to maintain cosmic order, okay? By the time of the Nasha Shastra, an ancient treatise on drama, instruments like the veena, an early stringed instrument, and the mridangam, a double-headed drum, became staples of religious and court music. But even as theory deepened, the soul of Indian music remained the same. Music as devotion, music as vibration, music as a bridge between body and spirit, sound and silence, mortal and divine. In the lands of the Indus, music wasn't written in ink, it was written in breath, beat, and eternity. In ancient China, music was never merely sound. It was cosmic order made audible, rooted in Confucian and Taoist philosophy. Early Chinese music sought to mirror the harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. To play music was not just to entertain, but to align oneself with the moral and natural rhythms of the universe. Some of the oldest archaeological finds include stone chimes, bianking, and bone flutes dating back to the Neolithic period. These instruments were carefully tuned, not just for beauty, but to reflect cosmic principles. Each note was associated with one of the 5 elements: fire, earth, metal, water, the seasons, and directions. A melody wasn't just music, it was philosophy and sound. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, 1046-2556 BCE, music had become a pillar of governance. Confucius himself famously said, "To educate someone, start with poetry, strengthen with ritual, and perfect with music." He believed that music shaped the soul and that a well-governed state would be reflected in its musical culture. Harsh or dissonant music meant disorder. Gentle, orderly tones signified harmony. Court musicians played with instruments like the gain, a 7-string zither associated with scholars and sages. Its quiet, introspective tones weren't meant to entertain crowds, but to cultivate inner virtue. The player sat alone, fingers brushing the strings in a meditative dialogue between self and nature. Larger ensembles used instruments like the shen, a mouth-blown free reed instrument, drums, and bronze bells, especially in ancestral rites and state ceremonies. The yo, or elegant music, was the official ceremonial genre used in rituals to honor heaven and ancestors. Every sound, every interval had a ritual function, carefully controlled to avoid spiritual imbalance. Chinese music theory also developed unique scales, such as the pentatonic scale, which uses 5 notes per octave. This gave Chinese melodies their fluid, drifting quality, evoking water, wind, and introspection. In ancient China, to hear music was to hear the balance of the world. To perform it well was to live well. Every note was a prayer, every silence a teaching. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, music was a conduit between heaven and earth, between grief and praise, between people and their covenant with God. It wasn't entertainment, it was sacred. Every note played, every voice lifted, was an offering. From the earliest books of the Hebrew Bible, music appears as a central force. In Genesis, Jubal is named as the father of all who played the lyre and pipe, suggesting that even at the very beginning, music was seen as a foundational human gift. In Exodus, after the Red Sea parts and the Israelites escape Egypt, Miriam takes up a timbre, leading women in dance and song, a moment of celebration, carved forever into sacred memory. By the time of King David, music had become a structured, integral part of spiritual life. David himself was both warrior and musician, said to calm King Saul's tormented spirit with the sound of his harp. Under his reign, music flourished as temple ritual. He appointed Levitical musicians whose role was not only to perform, but to preserve sacred songs and maintain spiritual order through sound. The Psalms, many attributed to David, form one of the oldest and richest hymnals in human history. These lyrical prayers, written in poetic form, were intended to be sung, chanted, or recited with instrumental accompaniment, usually lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets. Some psalms speak of sorrow, others of triumph, but all are musical expressions of the soul in dialogue with the divine. The first temple, built by Solomon, institutionalized music even further. Musicians were assigned shifts, instruments were standardized. Trumpets signaled offerings, cymbals marked sacred transitions. Music structured the calendar, framed the festivals, and deepened the meaning of every rite. Even after the temple's destruction, music lived on in memory and exile. In Babylon, the exiled Hebrews sang of Zion with trembling voices, by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat and wept. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? We sang. They did. Hebrew music survived, not by echoing through stone halls, but by being written on hearts. It was a music of resilience, born in covenant, and carried across centuries in breath, bone, and prayer. As the ancient world slowly gave way to classical antiquity and the medieval age, the music of early civilizations did not vanish. It transformed. Its instruments were altered, its scales adapted, its traditions absorbed into newer religious, philosophical, and cultural systems. But its essence endured. The echo of a Mesopotamian lyre, the shimmer of an Egyptian serum, the silence between strokes on a Chinese gin. These sounds did not die. They migrated, carried across time in the hands and hearts of those who remembered. In many ways, ancient music is a language we've forgotten how to fully speak, but never stopped listening for. We can't hear exactly how a Babylonian hymn sounded, We can only reconstruct it from clay tablets, fragmented notation, and ancient descriptions. But we can feel its intention, its effort to connect body and spirit, time and eternity. Even in the absence of full musical scores, we still see music etched in stone and painted on walls, dancing priestesses in Minoan fresco, harpists carved into Assyrian reliefs, Roman mosaics showing cithara players at feasts. These images are static, yet they pulse with rhythm. They remind us that ancient music was never background noise. It was the heartbeat of ritual, the breath of ceremony, the fire of protest, and the balm of grief. And remarkably, some of it lives on. In India, the Ras system still follows rules born from ancient Vedic chants. In China, ging players still perform melodies that date back to Confucian temples. In Jewish synagogues, psalms are still chanted with traditional melodies that echo back thousands of years. These aren't recreations. They are continuations. Ancient music wasn't recorded in vinyl or digitized into streams. It was preserved in practice, in people, in purpose, passed down not through wires, but through witnessing. We may never hear a perfect reconstruction of an Inca festival song or a hymn sung in the court of Tas, but when a hand drums, beat, or a voice breaks into spontaneous song, or a melody lingers just long enough to bring tears, that is ancient. The civilizations may have crumbled, the empires may have fallen, but their music still plays. Not in history books, but in us. Chapter 1. The first notes before cities rose, before kings claimed thrones, before temples carved stone to the sky, there was sound. Not music in the sense we know today, no written notation, no structured melody, but rhythm, pulse, and resonance. The first humans listened. They heard the crackle of fire as it leaped across dry brush, the patterned drip of water falling into stone basins, the rustle of leaves in wind. These were the original instruments, and their composers were not conscious of theory. They were instinctive, intuitive, alive. Somewhere in a dim cave, illuminated only by flickering torches, a figure crouched over a small, hollowed-out bone. Fingers, thick and calloused from toil, pressed holes along its length. The first note hissed through the cave, trembling, uncertain, yet unmistakably human. Another breath, another pitch. Soon, a sequence emerged, a primitive melody that echoed against walls painted with animals, hunters, and abstract symbols. Those walls weren't silent witnesses. They vibrated with the first human music. It was both warning and invitation, communication and art. Rhythm became memory. Early humans discovered that certain patterns could coordinate action. Lifting stones, carrying food, paddling canoes. A steady drum of hands against a hollow log brought many laborers in step, their bodies moving as one. It built trust, it built community, and when the hunt came, when the predator stalked the prey across frozen plains or dense forest, rhythm signaled anticipation, danger, and hope. Music wasn't entertainment, it was survival. And yet, even survival could not contain its beauty. Somewhere beyond utility, humans discovered delight in sound. The first songs were likely chants, long, repetitive, hypnotic. Voices rose and fell, sometimes mimicking the birds outside, sometimes the river's babble. A flute carved from mammoth ivory, dated over 40,000 years ago and found in German caves, represents the pinnacle of this early ingenuity. Carefully drilled holes allowed modulation, control of pitch, and subtle expression. Each note carried intention, a blend of emotion and meaning, as though the musician were speaking to the world itself. These instruments were sacred, not because humans worshipped them in the abstract, but because they connected the individual to everything else, the environment, the tribe, the unseen forces of life. Music marked life's cycles, births, deaths, hunts, feasts. In some caves, archaeologists have discovered paintings of animals alongside flutes and percussive bones. The imagery suggests that music accompanied ritual, perhaps as a plea to spirits or a celebration of bounty. Sound and sight intertwined. In these moments, humanity recognized that rhythm could shape reality, could move hearts and bodies, and even alter perception. The first instruments were diverse in materials and form. Bones, hollow reeds, stones, and shells were hollowed, carved, or struck. Percussion emerged naturally. Clapping hands, stomping feet, striking hollow logs. Sound was geometry made audible. The distance between two strikes determined tempo and repetition, gave birth to patterns humans could anticipate. A simple sequence of strikes might signal a leader's command, mark the passage of time, or prepare a group for the dangers of the night. Early humans learned to listen, to respond, and eventually to create. Music became conversation with the world. Over time, complexity emerged. Multiple instruments were combined, voices layered. One person might beat a drum while another whistled, while a third tapped stones together. This was the earliest ensemble, an untrained but intuitive orchestra. Each participant understood the social and spiritual function of their contribution. Music was not solitary, it was communal, and because it was woven into life itself, there was no distinction yet between art and utility. Music was both a bridge and a mirror, a bridge between people, between worlds, between life and death. A mirror reflecting fear, joy, longing, and wonder. In distant lands, the same impulses took shape differently. The Fertile Crescent saw the rise of Sumerian culture, where flutes, drums, and the first lyres would become central to civilization. Yet, even there, the roots trace back to this prehistory, simple, raw, instinctive. The lyre, with its delicately tuned strings, carried ritual, celebration, and mourning. Each note was imbued with purpose, a codified expression of emotion and belief. And the Mesopotamians began recording these sounds, not in audio, but on clay. Cuneiform tablets captured hymns, melodies, and instructions, an extraordinary leap from ephemeral sound to permanence. Across the world, in what would millennia later become India, the Indus Valley civilizations were experimenting with tone and rhythm in clay flutes and terracotta drums. In China, Neolithic stone chimes and early flutes mirrored cosmic order, each note linked to nature, philosophy, and the unseen. In Africa, percussive traditions thrived, using drums to connect villages and send messages across distances impossible to cover on foot. Across continents, humans understood one truth: sound could communicate what words could not. And through all these civilizations, music retained its duality. It was practical and sacred, emotional and communal, functional and aesthetic. It built societies, guided rituals, carried memory, and expressed what lay beyond language. The earliest songs were not sung to entertain. They were sung to live, to remember, to belong, to reach beyond the body, beyond the tribe, and touch the eternal. By the time humans built permanent settlements, constructed temples, and developed writing, music had already become integral to identity. It was no longer just survival or ritual. It was culture itself, shaped the moral and social order, influenced power structures, and became a vessel for memory. Music, in essence, was civilization's first bridge linking generations, connecting mortal and divine, binding past and present, and laying the foundation for every culture that followed. Chapter 2: Mesopotamia and the Birth of Notation. The first songs, the first rhythms, have been born of instinct and necessity, echoing across caves, rivers, and forests. But as humans settled into cities, as civilizations took root along fertile rivers and coasts, sound became something more than survival. It became structure, it became law, it became memory. And nowhere was this transformation more profound than in the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the earth yielded barley and dates, and the rivers threatened with flood. as much as they nourished. Humans built the first cities, Uruk, Ur, and Lagash. Here, amid mud brick walls and ziggurats reaching toward the sky, sound was no longer accidental. It was cultivated, trained, and taught. Music accompanied every ritual, every festival, every market gathering. Okay? It gave rhythm to the irrigation channels, to labor, and to the ebb and flow of political life. Music marked authority. It announced kings, celebrated victories, mourned the dead. But sound alone could not last. Notes faded as soon as breath ended. Memory, while powerful, was fallible. Mesopotamian scribes understood that if music was to endure, it had to be captured, codified, recorded. And so, they did what they did best. They wrote clay tablets, pressed with reed styluses, preserved the first attempts at musical notation. What survives today, fragmentary, mysterious, incomplete hints at a world where the human desire to preserve beauty and order intersected with the technology of writing. One of the earliest surviving examples comes from the city of Ugarit, around 1400 BCE here. A clay tablet holds hymns with markings that indicate string plucking, scales, and relative pitch. These weren't instructions for amateur play. They were professional guides designed for temple musicians, trained in ritual precision. Each note had purpose. Each pause was deliberate. This was music elevated from ephemeral art to permanent record. It was a leap that would ripple across time and space, forming a bridge between human expression and the divine. In temples, music became inseparable from worship. Priests and priestesses used lyres, harps, drums, and reed instruments to summon the gods, petition for rain, harvest, and victory. Each instrument carried symbolism. The lyre, with its delicate strings, represented balance and harmony. The drum embodied the heartbeat of the city. The flute echoed the wind in the whispers of the unseen world. Music was not entertainment. It was the language of the cosmos made tangible. But Mesopotamian music also served governance. Royal ceremonies and civic events required precision and order. Certain melodies were assigned to specific kings or deities. Musicians became bureaucrats of sound, responsible for codifying the intangible and ensuring it aligned with social order. The king's power was amplified by music. The ruler's command was reinforced through rhythm, repetition, and ceremonial song. Even the construction of canals, walls, and city gates was accompanied by rhythmic labor songs, ensuring coordination and communal effort. The instruments themselves evolved alongside society. Lyres were adorned with inlays of gold, lapis lazuli, and carved animals, not merely for decoration, but as vessels of sacred significance. Drums, both handheld and large, controlled pace and mood. Percussion was central, stamping, clapping, striking hollow reeds, all synchronized to ritual movement. And the voices of singers, trained in schools, carried melody across courtyards and plazas, ensuring the continuity of hymns and chants. Not only was music functional and sacred, but it also became the first vessel of professional artistry. Musicians were revered, trained from childhood, and sometimes institutionalized in temple schools. Knowledge passed from teacher to student, generation to generation, ensuring that melodies preserved across centuries retained fidelity and form. And yet, within these constraints, creativity thrived. Composers improvised within established frameworks, weaving personal expression into sacred tradition. The mathematics of sound was not lost on Mesopotamian thinkers. Intervals, pitch, and rhythm were observed and categorized. Music mirrored the natural order. Rivers flowed in patterns. Seasons cycled predictably, and stars moved in arcs. By aligning musical scales with cosmic principles, humans attempted to understand the universe through sound. The earliest forms of harmony were thus born not from whim, but from observational desire to mirror heaven on earth. Through music, history was preserved. Hymns commemorated victories, mourned tragedies, and celebrated agricultural cycles. Songs became chronicles, embedding cultural memory in melody and meter. And as civilizations expanded through trade, conquest, and migrations, these musical principles spread. Instruments traveled, scales migrated, and notation techniques were adapted to new languages and contexts. The lyre of yore became the harp of Egypt. The drum of Sumer informed percussion in India, and rhythms of Mesopotamian festivals echoed in later Hellenistic cities. Yet, music was not just a tool for preservation, it was also a subtle instrument of resistance. In times of upheaval, songs carried hidden messages. Layers of melody and rhythm could encode warnings, rally communities, and preserve forbidden knowledge. Music became a conduit for courage, hope, and identity, ensuring that even in the shadow of empire, individual and collective voices endured. Thus, in Mesopotamia, the ephemeral became permanent. The first musical notes recorded in clay were more than sounds. They were a testament to human ingenuity, spirituality, and the enduring desire to communicate across time. Civilization and music were entwined. One could not flourish without the other. And in this crucible, humanity discovered a profound truth. That sound, structured and remembered, could outlast stone, river, and dynasty. Chapter 3. Egypt, Temple Hymns, and Cosmic Resonance. If Mesopotamia gave us the first instruments and the earliest written music, then Egypt transformed sound into a living, breathing force that shaped both the mortal and divine realms. Along the fertile banks of the Nile, civilization rose with astonishing consistency. Seasons were predictable, floods were life-giving, and human ingenuity found expression, not only in monumental pyramids and temples, but in the rhythms that underscored every aspect of Egyptian life. In Egypt, music was inseparable from ritual, from the cosmic order itself. From the Old Kingdom onward, temples were alive with sound. Every day, priests and priestesses performed hymns at sunrise to greet the gods, their voices echoing across marble halls and open courtyards. Harps, lyres, flutes, and percussion instruments accompanied their chants, transforming stone corridors into conduits of divine resonance. The Egyptians believed that sound had the power to calm gods, to heal the sick, and even to guide the dead on their journey to the afterlife. Music was magic incarnate, a bridge between worlds. The instruments themselves were objects of both beauty and ritual significance. Harps came in curved or angular forms, their strings crafted from animal gut, stretched to exact tension. Lyres were decorated with gold, faience, and carved imagery of deities, animals, or cosmic symbols. Percussion instruments from drums to rattles and clappers punctuated ceremonies, each rhythm marking a precise moment in a ritual. Even the simplest instrument held sacred weight. A framed drum struck at the wrong time could invite chaos instead of order. Priest musicians underwent rigorous training. They were not entertainers. They were mediators between the earthly and divine. They learned scales, modes, and chants, memorized hymns passed down through generations, and mastered complex rhythms designed to mirror cosmic cycles. Egyptian music theory, though less formalized than later Greek or Chinese systems, understood harmony, resonance, and the emotional impact of tone. Each sound, each vibration, corresponded to aspects of the natural and spiritual world: water, sky, fertility, death, and renewal. Funerary music illustrates the power and purpose of sound in Egypt. Tombs of the Old Kingdom, such as those at Saqqara and Giza, contain murals depicting musicians playing lyres and flutes, dancers moving to percussive rhythms, and singers performing hymns for the deceased. In some tombs, small instruments were buried alongside the dead, meant to accompany them into the afterlife. These were not decorative. They were functional, ensuring the journey to eternity was accompanied by the familiar comforts of sound. Music was both memorial and protective charm. Music was also deeply tied to social life beyond the temple walls. Festivals, processions, and daily market activity all resonated with sound. Street musicians performed for crowds. Children clapped along with rhythmic chants, and dancers moved to melodies that echoed the pulse of the Nile itself. Percussion instruments allowed those without formal training to participate, creating communal experiences that transcended language. Rhythm became a shared language, binding communities together in celebration, mourning, and worship. Women played a central role in Egyptian music, often as vocalists and instrumentalists. Professional female musicians performed in temples, at funerals, and during festivals. They were sometimes hired to lead mourning rituals, their voices trained to express sorrow in precise and emotionally resonant ways. These women were custodians of cultural memory, ensuring that songs, stories, and religious observances persisted through generations. Their contribution was not ancillary. It was foundational, shaping the emotional and spiritual life of the nation. Music in Egypt was inextricably linked to cosmology, its rhythmic cycles of songs, the scales chosen for chants, and the harmonics produced by instruments were all believed to align with the order of the cosmos. Each temple had its own musical traditions, often tied to the specific deity it honored. Hathor, goddess of music, love, and fertility. Hathor was frequently depicted holding the sistrum, a rattle-like instrument whose jingling sound was thought to awaken life itself. To play the sistrum was to invoke divine presence, to participate in creation, and to harmonize human activity with celestial order. Royal courts, too, were alive with music. Pharaohs employed musicians, not merely for entertainment, but as instruments of statecraft. Music accompanied military parades, royal decrees, and diplomatic ceremonies. It projected power, asserted authority, and reinforced social hierarchy. Yet, in moments of private devotion, it also offered solace. A pharaoh listening to a harpist at sunrise might hear not a display of grandeur, but a reflection of cosmic order and personal reflection. Music was both public and profoundly intimate. As Egypt expanded and exchanged ideas with neighboring civilizations, its musical traditions evolved and spread. Egyptian instruments influenced Greek, Roman, and even Mesopotamian cultures. The harp, lyre, and sistrum found new contexts in foreign courts and temples, while Egyptian hymns inspired melodies and ritual practices far beyond the Nile. Yet, despite these outward flows, Egypt retained a uniquely sacred view of sound. Music was a vehicle of continuity, linking generations, mortals, and gods, the living and the dead. Through these developments, we begin to see a pattern. Music in early civilizations was never merely aesthetic, it was structural, functional, and deeply symbolic. In Mesopotamia, music codified order and connected humans to the divine. In Egypt, it guided the soul, harmonized society, and bridged life and death. Across continents and centuries, humans realized the same fundamental truth: that sound could shape the world, create memory, and imbue meaning where words alone might fail. Even as instruments and styles evolved, the fundamental principle persisted. Music is a conduit of human intention, whether echoing through ziggurats, flowing along Nile temples, or vibrating across early city streets. Music connected body and spirit, time and eternity, self and community. It preserved memory when writing had not yet reached all corners. It communicated emotion when language could not. And, perhaps most importantly, it allowed humans to participate in something greater than themselves, a cosmic rhythm that transcended the ephemeral, touching both the mortal and the divine. Chapter 4. Greece, Philosophy, K, and the Mathematics of Sound. While Egypt shaped music as a sacred force intertwined with life, death, and divine order, Greece transformed sound into a tool of human understanding, philosophy, and civic life. Music was no longer only a matter of ritual. It became a reflection of logic, ethics, and cosmic balance. Greeks inherited instruments, scales, and melodies from neighboring civilizations, but they refined them, giving structure, theory, and meaning that resonated through both temples and marketplaces. The Greek word musek, from which we derive music, encompassed far more than melody. It signified the domain of the muses, the goddesses of inspiration for poetry, dance, and song. To engage in music was to draw directly from divine influence. Music was both art and science, pleasure and instruction, emotion and intellect. It was a practice that touched every aspect of human existence, shaping the soul while connecting citizens to the cosmos. In the education of Greek youth, music was central. Boys of aristocratic families were taught to play the lyra, a stringed instrument associated with Apollo. Mastery of this instrument was more than entertainment. It was a moral and intellectual exercise. The Greeks believed that music shaped character. Certain modes and scales could cultivate virtue, courage, and discipline, while others could incite laziness, melancholy, or moral corruption. Plato famously argued that the Dorian mode instilled courage and fortitude, while the Phrygian mode inspired excitement and emotional release. A society's music was, therefore, a reflection of its moral health. Greek music was tightly linked to poetry and theater. Tragedy and comedy were never silent. Every line of dialogue carried rhythm. Every choral passage followed a structured meter, and instruments accompanied action to underscore emotion. Talos, a double-piped reed instrument, added intensity and drama, its sharp, penetrating tone guiding the audience through tragedy, lament, and triumph. Even civic rituals were orchestrated, with music reinforcing social cohesion. Festivals, athletic competitions, and religious ceremonies all followed precise musical protocols. The Greeks recognized music as a tool of influence, capable of shaping the hearts, minds, behaviors of both individuals and communities. Pythagoras, better remembered today for mathematics, was one of the first to formalize the relationship between sound and numbers. He observed that harmonious notes could be produced from simple ratios. A 2-to-1 ratio produced an octave, 3-to-2, a fifth, 4-to-3, a fourth. These numerical relationships formed the basis of Greek musical theory and inspired the concept of the music of the spheres, a cosmic harmony in which planets and stars moved according to precise mathematical ratios. The idea that the universe itself could be understood through sound and number-bridged music, mathematics, and philosophy, influencing thinkers for centuries. Plato extended these ideas, arguing that music shaped the soul and, by extension, the state. In its ideal republic, the education of citizens included rigorous musical training. Certain scales and rhythms were encouraged to promote civic virtue, while others were censored to prevent moral decay. Aristotle, in turn, emphasized music's emotional power, analyzing its effects on the mind and body. Music, he argued, was both cathartic and instructive, capable of releasing pent-up emotions while guiding ethical reflection. Greek instruments reflected this philosophical rigor. The lyra was central to education and ritual, its strings plucked with precision to produce clear, measured tones. The kathira, a larger, more sophisticated version, was used in professional and sacred performances. Percussion instruments, such as drums or cymbals, provided rhythm, often synchronized with dance or military display. Music was a discipline. Notes, intervals, rhythm, and melody were all part of a structured system that could convey emotion, uphold tradition, and mirror universal order. In public life, music served both entertainment and civic cohesion. Festivals like the Panathenaea combined athletic competition with song and dance, integrating music into the very identity of the polis. Citizens were trained to perform in choruses, recite hymns, and participate in ceremonies. In the theater, music and drama were inseparable. Choruses sang complex odes, while actors enacted stories of gods and heroes. In every sphere, music guided human action, reinforced memory, and elevated emotion. Greek music also preserved oral tradition. Homeric epics, for instance, were sung to the accompaniment of stringed instruments. The Iliad and Odyssey were not mere texts. They were performed experiences, blending narrative, melody, and rhythm to anchor stories in collective memory. The combination of poetry and music created a mnemonic device, ensuring that myths, values, and cultural knowledge could survive across generations long before widespread literacy. Philosophers and mathematicians did not treat music lightly. It was studied scientifically and spiritually. Instruments were measured, scales defined, and intervals tested for their harmonic resonance. The Greeks understood that sound could influence both individual behavior and the cohesion of society. Civic leaders recognized that music was a subtle form of governance, capable of teaching discipline, inspiring courage, and uniting the people under shared aesthetic and ethical principles. At the same time, music was deeply personal and emotional. It accompanied birth, death, and daily life. Women performed as singers and musicians in domestic, ceremonial, and religious contexts. Music accompanied weddings, funerals, and mourning rituals, weaving human experience into the broader fabric of divine and social order. It was simultaneously public and private, structured and spontaneous, cerebral and emotive. As Greek culture spread through colonization and trade, its musical innovations influenced neighboring regions, including Rome, North Africa, and Asia Minor. Greek instruments, scales, and musical philosophy traveled with merchants, soldiers, and scholars, seeding new traditions while preserving core principles. Music became both a vehicle of cultural influence and a bridge between civilizations, connecting people through shared experience and common rhythm. By the Hellenistic period, Greek music had become increasingly complex. Scholars cataloged instruments, theorized about modes and scales, and debated ethical and emotional effects. Harmonia, the various tonal systems, were carefully documented, while instruments like the kithara, alos, and hydraulis were refined for greater expressive range. Music was at once art, science, and moral compass, reflecting the intricate interplay of logic, aesthetics, and human psychology. Greek music theory influenced not only performance, but education, civic life, and philosophy. Pythagorean principles of numerical harmony echoed in architecture, astronomy, and medicine. Plato's and Aristotle's writings codified the ethical and emotional impact of sound. Musicians were not mere performers. They were scholars, philosophers, and teachers, entrusted with the moral and intellectual cultivation of their communities. Music shaped the citizen, guided the soul, and mirrored the cosmos. In this way, Greek music represents a profound evolution from the sacred chants of Egypt and Mesopotamia. It preserved the spiritual and social functions of sound, while layering it with logic, theory, and philosophy. Music became a tool for understanding the universe, educating citizens, and structuring human experience. It was simultaneously divine, civic, and personal reflection of the Greek quest to harmonize the earthly and the eternal. Chapter 5. Rome, Power, Spectacle, and the Sound of Empire as Greek music evolved into a structured, ethical, and philosophical pursuit. Rome approached sound with a different lens. The Romans inherited instruments, scales, and theory from their Greek neighbors. But in their hands, music became a tool of power, spectacle, and practical functionality. While philosophy shaped Greek music, utility and authority shaped Roman music. The pulse of Rome was martial, political, and ceremonial, and sound followed every aspect of civic life. The Roman state was a symphony of order and control, and music became one of its instruments. In the military, the cornu, a large curved brass horn, signaled maneuvers across vast battlefields. Soldiers, trained to respond instantly to a blast, moved with precision, forming the phalanx or engaging in combat dictated by the signal. Similarly, the tuba, a straight bronze trumpet, issued alerts, warnings, and triumphal calls. Every note was functional, every rhythm purposeful. Unlike Greece, where melody could inspire virtue, Roman martial music was a mechanism of control and coordination. Music also served civic and religious purposes. Roman temples, festivals, and triumphal processions relied heavily on instruments and ensembles. Priests chanted hymns in precise rhythm, while public games echoed with tibi, flutes, and percussive accompaniment. Every ritual, from a harvest celebration to the dedication of a new aqueduct, resonated with orchestrated sound designed to reinforce order and evoke awe. Roman music was public by necessity. It unified communities, displayed power, and impressed the populace. Beyond ritual and warfare, Roman music thrived in entertainment. Amphitheaters and circuses echoed with horns, drums, and stringed instruments. Gladiatorial games were not silent spectacles. The clash of steel, the roar of the crowd, and the rhythm of percussion created a holistic sensory experience. Musicians performed to heighten drama, cue combatants, and guide audience emotion. Unlike Greek music, which often focused on internal cultivation and philosophical reflection, Roman music emphasized external impact, spectacle, and authority. The Romans inherited the Greek lyra, kithora, and allos, but they adapted these instruments to their own tastes and purposes. The hydraulis, a water-powered organ, became emblematic of Roman ingenuity and grandeur, combining engineering with sound to produce awe-inspiring tones. Courtly banquets, religious festivals, and even the homes of the elite featured professional musicians. Women, slaves, and trained performers provided entertainment, ritual, accompaniment, and musical instruction. In these settings, music demonstrated social hierarchy. It was a mark of wealth, refinement, and cultural knowledge. In the military and civic sphere, Roman music was inseparable from the exercise of power. Trumpets and horns dictated the movements of legions, guided logistics, and communicated across long distances. Percussion instruments coordinated labor and heightened ceremonial impact. Music amplified authority. It made legions intimidating rituals, solemn, and the city itself a living orchestra of control. The soundscape of Rome was as meticulously engineered as its roads, aqueducts, and amphitheaters. Yet Roman music was not merely functional. In private and domestic life, it became a vehicle for pleasure, seduction, and emotional expression. In elite households, stringed instruments like the cithara and lyra accompanied poetry readings, dances, and feasts. Dancers moved to precise rhythms, creating immersive spectacles that blended artistry, entertainment, and ritual. Music mediated relationships, set moods, and demonstrated sophistication. Unlike Greek music, which often emphasized moral and civic training, Roman music emphasized social refinement and aesthetic display. Romans also developed unique musical genres. Hymns, chants, and ceremonial songs intertwined with religious practice, while theatrical music and comedies and tragedies guided audiences through plot and emotion. The Carmen, sacred chants, influenced spiritual outcomes, invoking divine favor or protection. Music carried messages, structured events, and delineated sacred from secular. It was a pervasive force, controlling emotion, shaping social conduct, and reinforcing hierarchy. Interestingly, Rome also became a melting pot for musical innovation. Conquered territories contributed instruments, melodies, and performance techniques. Etruscan trumpets influenced military signaling, Greek instruments shaped education and entertainment, and Egyptian rhythms inspired ritual accompaniment. Music in Rome became a cultural patchwork, unified by purpose, control, celebration, and spectacle. The empire carried this music wherever its legions marched, leaving echoes of Roman orchestration from Britain to Egypt. Music in the home, however, remained intimate. Women often led private performances, instructing children, participating in rituals, or entertaining guests. Their contributions were central to the preservation and evolution of musical practice. Yet, they were rarely documented in surviving texts. Nonetheless, archaeological finds, frescoes, mosaics, and inscriptions indicate that women played lyres, flutes, and percussion instruments, creating a domestic soundscape as vital as any public spectacle. Roman philosophy occasionally reflected on music, but more as a complement to ethics and civic life than as an independent pursuit. Stoic thinkers recognized music's emotional power, often warning of its potential to inflame passions or undermine discipline. Epicureans celebrated its pleasures, acknowledging music's capacity to delight and soothe. Across social strata, music remained inseparable from human experience. It was education, entertainment, ritual, and emotional regulation. The lasting legacy of Roman music lies not only in instruments or compositions, but in its integration with state, ritual, and society. Roman roads carried not only legions, but also musicians, instruments, and musical customs. Provincial peoples absorbed Roman sounds, blending them with local traditions. Music became a tool of cultural diffusion, empire building, and memory preservation. Even as political power waned, musical influence endured, seeding traditions that would resurface in medieval Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Music, therefore, in Rome, was more than entertainment. It was a medium of influence, a channel of authority, and a vehicle for societal cohesion. Every trumpet blast, percussion, strike, and string pluck communicated not only sound but structure, hierarchy, and cultural identity. The Romans understood that music could regulate emotion, guide behavior, and shape collective experience. In this, Rome extended the achievements of earlier civilizations, combining practical application with ritual significance to produce a soundscape that was both omnipresent and deeply functional. The echo of Rome's musical culture persists in modern orchestration, ceremonial fanfares, and even military signaling. When a trumpet sounds at a contemporary event, the lineage of purpose, authority, and spectacle reaches back to the Roman Empire. Every note carries centuries of human intention to organize, to celebrate, to command, and to communicate. In Rome, music was not passive. It was active, pervasive, and alive, woven into the very fabric of society. From the orchestral temples of Greece to the strategic signals of Rome, music was evolving into a universal human force, a bridge between the sacred and the social, between emotion and order, between individuals and the collective. It was no longer just sounded, with structure, governance, and identity. Chapter 6: Medieval Music, between sacred and secular. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, its organized soundscape did not vanish. Instead, it transformed, adapting to a world now fragmented by shifting kingdoms, monasteries, and emergent cultural identities. The medieval period witnessed the birth of new musical systems, deeply intertwined with faith, politics, and community. Cant became both a guide and a sanctuary in a world where instability was the norm. The most immediate heirs of Roman musical tradition were the Christian churches. Monastic communities, particularly in regions like Gaul, Italy, and Iberia, became centers of musical innovation. Music in these sacred spaces was not mere ornamentation. It was a spiritual language. The Gregorian chant, named for Pope Gregory I, emerged as the defining sound of early medieval worship. These monophonic melodies, sung in unison without instrumental accompaniment, were designed to elevate the soul and focus the mind. Their flowing, non-metric lines reflected a sense of timelessness, a suspension of earthly concerns in favor of the eternal. Chant served multiple purposes. Liturgically, it marked the hours of prayer, the cycles of feast and fast, and the rhythm of daily monastic life. Psychologically, it provided consistency and structure in communities facing political turmoil and social upheaval. And, symbolically, it linked worshippers across space and time. A monk in a Benedictine abbey in France was, in a sense, singing the same melody as a counterpart in Rome or Jerusalem. Music became a thread of continuity, a shared human experience transcending local instability. In addition to chant, The medieval period saw the development of notation, a transformative innovation. Early neumes, placed above text in manuscripts, began as reminders for singers who already knew the melody. Over time, these symbols evolved into a more precise system, indicating pitch and, eventually, rhythm. With notation, music could be preserved, transmitted, and studied. Knowledge that had been orally transmitted for centuries was now codified. This allowed for increasingly complex compositions, polyphony, and the eventual flourishing of medieval, secular, and sacred repertoire. Secular music, often overshadowed by sacred compositions and surviving manuscripts, was nevertheless vibrant and culturally significant. Minstrels, troubadours, and jongleurs traveled across Europe, performing songs that recounted heroic deeds, romantic exploits, and local lore. These performers were not only entertainers, but also custodians of memory. The music reinforced social norms, celebrated local heroes, and disseminated news across regions. Instruments like the lute, harp, psaltery, and various percussion instruments accompanied them, giving their stories a memorable rhythm and cadence. Courtly music, emerging in the castles of France, England, and the Iberian Peninsula, was an elaborate blend of performance, poetry, and ritualized display. The troubadours crafted intricate lyrics set to refined melodies, often emphasizing themes of love, loyalty, and chivalric ideals. Music in this context was performative, aesthetic, and socially functional. It reinforced hierarchies, showcased refinement, and cultivated cultural cohesion among the elite. Nobles did not merely consume music, they used it to demonstrate sophistication, influence, and political identity. Meanwhile, in rural communities, folk music thrived, often in forms that were functional as much as expressive. Work songs, synchronized labor, communal dances reinforced social bonds, and ritual songs marked seasonal transitions, harvests, and fertility rites. These melodies were transmitted orally, adaptable to local context, and intimately tied to the land and its cycles. The music of peasants and farmers, though rarely preserved in written form, provided the foundation for later European musical traditions, linking the sacred and secular, the elite and the everyday. Music also played a crucial role in education and spiritual formation. Monks and nuns learned to chant as part of their daily discipline, developing not only vocal skills, but also mental focus and moral training. Music was considered an intellectual pursuit. It embodied mathematical relationships, symbolic meanings, and cosmic order, echoing the Pythagorean traditions inherited from antiquity. The medieval scholar viewed music as a bridge between the earthly and divine, a reflection of order in a world otherwise marked by unpredictability and decay. The instruments of the medieval period were diverse and regionally specific. Stringed instruments like the rebec and viol produced lyrical tones suitable for both sacred and secular contexts. Instruments, including the shawm, bagpipe, and flute, often accompanied outdoor festivities, pageants, and military parades. Percussion instruments, tambourines, bells provided rhythm, signaling, and ceremonial emphasis. The medieval orchestra, though less standardized than modern ensembles, reflected the same principle as ancient music, the fusion of utility, ritual, and emotion. Medieval music also became a vehicle for cultural diplomacy and social cohesion. Keys, religious institutions, and marketplaces. Music communicated identity, reinforced tradition, and sometimes mediated conflict. Its rhythms and melodies bound communities together, offering continuity amid political fragmentation, invasions, and economic uncertainty. Just as Roman music reinforced authority, medieval music reinforced communal identity, morality, and spiritual focus. The period also witnessed the growth of polyphony, a revolutionary development in musical complexity. Composers began layering independent melodic lines, creating textures that expanded emotional and intellectual resonance. Polyphonic structures were not only aesthetically pleasing, but also metaphorically rich. They represented harmony within diversity, order emerging from complexity, and the coexistence of multiple voices within a unified framework. This intellectual and artistic achievement laid the groundwork for the musical evolution of the Renaissance, emphasizing innovation rooted in tradition. The influence of medieval music extended beyond Europe. Trade, conquest, and religious pilgrimage facilitated cultural exchange with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and North Africa. Andalusian courts absorbed melodies and instruments from Arab traditions, blending them with local European forms. Jewish communities dispersed across Europe and the Mediterranean preserved and adapted musical traditions in synagogues and homes. Music became a channel for intercultural dialogue, exchange, and hybridization, carrying both memory and innovation across continents. Ultimately, medieval music demonstrated the enduring human impulse to connect, express, and endure. Whether through chant, lute, performance, or the communal pulse of folk rhythm, it remained a bridge between individuals, communities, and generations. Music continued to serve multiple masters: spiritual, political, social, and emotional. And like its predecessors in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, it was never merely entertainment. Music shaped thought, anchored memory, and structured human experience. As the medieval period progressed toward the Renaissance, these musical foundations matured into increasingly sophisticated forms, setting the stage for monumental developments in harmony, notation, and composition. The echoes of chants, minstrels, and early polyphony reverberated through time, shaping the very way humans approached sound, expression, and collective identity. Chapter 7. The Renaissance, Rebirth of Sound and Innovation. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe had begun to emerge from the shadows of the medieval world. Cities were growing, trade was flourishing, and ideas were traveling faster than ever before. The Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and thought, was not limited to painting, architecture, or literature. It transformed music profoundly. For the first time since antiquity, humanism became central to musical creation. Composers were not merely instruments of divine or royal command, but creators whose work celebrated human ingenuity, emotion, and intellect. The heart of Renaissance music was polyphony, which reached unprecedented complexity and refinement. Composers like Josquin des Prez, Guillaume Dufay, and Orlando di Lasso experimented with multiple interweaving melodic lines, crafting compositions that were not only beautiful, but intellectually sophisticated. Each line had its own identity, yet all worked together to form a coherent whole, mirroring the humanistic ideals of harmony, balance, and proportion. Music, in this sense, became a microcosm of the universe, echoing the mathematical and philosophical principles rediscovered from Greek antiquity. The invention of music printing in the early 16th century revolutionized access to musical knowledge. Prior to this, music had to be painstakingly copied by hand, limiting its reach to wealthy courts and monasteries. With printing, compositions could be distributed widely, allowing both professional and amateur musicians to explore increasingly sophisticated repertoires. Music became democratized, bridging social divides and fostering a shared European culture of sound. Instrumental music, too, flourished during the Renaissance, while the medieval period had focused heavily on vocal music. Renaissance composers began writing specifically for instruments. Lute emerged as a symbol of intimate, personal expression, with elaborate tablatures guiding players through intricate polyphonic lines. The viol, a bowed string instrument, offered expressive capabilities that rivaled the human voice. Harpsichords, early organs, and wind instruments such as the recorder, cornet, and sack, but added color and depth to ensembles. Instrumental music began to explore texture, harmony, and contrast in ways previously unimaginable, reflecting both aesthetic sophistication and technical innovation. Sacred music remained central, but it too evolved. The Mass and Motet were no longer simple chants set to text. They became elaborate musical architectures. Composers used imitation, canon, and counterpoint to create works that engaged both the mind and the spirit. Each note, each interval, was chosen deliberately to enhance textual meaning and emotional impact. Music, in this sense, was a moral and intellectual exercise as much as a spiritual one. At the same time, secular music experienced a flowering of creativity. Courts across Italy, France, and England commissioned songs, dances, and madrigals to celebrate love, political events, and civic pride. The Italian madrigal, in particular, became a vehicle for expressive text painting. Composers mirrored the emotional content of words in melodic contour, rhythm, and harmony. If a text spoke of sorrow, the melody might descend. If of joy, it might leap upward. This attention to the union of word and sound reflected Renaissance humanism, in which human experience, emotion, and intellect were central. Music in the Renaissance also reflected the growing exchange of cultures. The Mediterranean, connected by trade and political interaction, allowed ideas from the Arab world, Byzantium, and North Africa to permeate European music. Instruments like the oud influenced the European lute, while rhythmic patterns and ornamentation traveled across continents. The Renaissance was as much a story of movement, of people, ideas, and sound as it was of artistic innovation. Opera, though emerging slightly later in the early Baroque, had its roots in Renaissance experiments in blending drama, poetry, and music. Composers began to explore how music could not only accompany text, but embody it fully. By the end of the Renaissance, the stage was prepared for monumental works that would integrate narrative, emotion, and sound in ways unmatched by any prior culture. In addition, music education became formalized. Choirs, conservatories, and universities began to offer systematic instruction in theory, notation, and performance. Renaissance theorists like Josefo Zolino codified rules of counterpoint and harmony, laying the groundwork for the tonal system that would dominate Western music for centuries. The intellectualization of music reflected a broader cultural shift, the recognition that sound, like painting or poetry, was a craft requiring study, reflection, and mastery. Through all of these innovations, music retained its social and spiritual functions. It continued to structure religious life, enhance civic rituals, and provide entertainment. But Renaissance music also became a means of personal expression, a reflection of human creativity and intellect. Composers and performers were no longer faceless agents of church or court. They were artists shaping experience, emotion, and perception through sound. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of notation systems capable of representing rhythm and dynamics with greater precision. Mensural notation allowed composers to specify durations, syncopations, and complex rhythmic interplay. Dynamics, ornamentation, and articulation began to be notated, giving performers more explicit guidance and allowing compositions to be reproduced more faithfully. Music was no longer ephemeral. It could be preserved, analyzed, and taught systematically. Moreover, the relationship between music and science became increasingly explicit. Composers and theorists explored the mathematical ratios underlying intervals, echoing Pythagorean thought. It bridged the sacred and secular, the intimate and public, the emotional and intellectual. By the end of the Renaissance, music had undergone a transformation almost as profound as the rise of civilization itself. What had begun as ritual, work song, and spiritual chant had become a fully developed art form, capable of expressing subtle emotion, complex ideas, and profound beauty. It was no longer merely a tool for worship or celebration. It was a medium for exploring the depths of human experience, for shaping thought, and for bridging the eternal and the temporal. Chapter 8. The Baroque Era, Ornamentation, Drama. In the birth of opera, the dawn of the 17th century saw Europe entering the Baroque era period of excess, grandeur, and expressivity in all forms of art. If the Renaissance celebrated balance and proportion, The Baroque reveled in contrast, tension, and spectacle. Music, like painting and architecture, embraced drama, movement, and emotional intensity. The Baroque was not subtle. It was an era that demanded attention, drawing listeners into a vivid, almost theatrical experience. At the heart of Baroque music was the emergence of opera, the art form that fused music, theater, poetry, and spectacle. Italy, particularly Venice and Florence, became the crucible of this innovation. Composers like Claudio Monteverdi pushed the boundaries of musical storytelling. His opera El Orfeo, 1607, was among the first to integrate fully developed instrumental accompaniment with vocal lines, creating a sense of dramatic realism previously unseen. Music, no longer merely adorned words, became a vehicle for narrative, emotion, and psychological depth. The Baroque era also saw the rise of the basso continuo, a continuous bass line played by instruments such as the harpsichord, organ, lute, or cello. This harmonic foundation allowed composers to craft intricate melodic lines above it, creating textures rich with tension and release. The basso continuo became the heartbeat of Baroque ensembles, providing stability while allowing immense freedom for ornamentation and improvisation. Ornamentation was central to Baroque music. Trails, mordents, appoggiaturas, and elaborate runs allowed performers to express emotion vividly and interpret music personally. Virtuosity was celebrated. Performers were expected not only to play the notes, but to imbue them with flair, emotion, and personality. Composers like Arcangelo Corelli and Francesco Gimignani wrote music that highlighted technical skill, rewarding dexterous and expressive performers. Instrumental music blossomed during the Baroque period. The violin family became central to orchestras, and composers like Antonio Vivaldi pushed the instrument to new heights. His Four Seasons captured the seasons in sound, using musical motifs to represent birdsong, storms, and flowing rivers. The Baroque orchestra, though smaller than its Romantic era descendant, was capable of immense expressivity. The interplay between strings, winds, and basso continuo created textures that were both intricate and emotionally compelling. Sacred music also reached new heights. Johann Sebastian Bach, often regarded as the pinnacle of Baroque composition, transformed the cantata, mass, and passion into profound statements of faith, intellect, and artistry. His music was deeply structured mathematically, yet overflowing with emotion and spiritual weight. Counterpoint reached unprecedented complexity, with multiple independent lines weaving together in dense, harmonious patterns. Bach's St. Matthew, Passion, and Mass in B minor remain unparalleled examples of how music could merge technical mastery with spiritual profundity. The Baroque era also gave birth to the concerto, a form that contrasted soloist against ensemble, individual against collective. Composers like Vivaldi and later Antonio Lucio Vivaldi made the violin a hero of this form, while George Friedrich Handel and Arcangelo Corelli explored its expressive potential. These works highlighted the tension between unity and individuality, between harmony and dramatic contrast, embodying the Baroque ethos itself. Opera, instrumental music, sacred compositions, and chamber works all reflected the Baroque fascination with contrast. Music alternated between loud and soft terrace dynamics, slow and fast, simple and complex. The era celebrated extremes joy and sorrow, love and tragedy, divine awe and human passion. Composers sought to move the listener profoundly, to create experiences that were emotional, intellectual, and spiritual simultaneously. Baroque music also spread across Europe through the growing patronage system. Courts, churches, and cities became centers of musical innovation. Louis XIV's court in France, with composers like Jean-Baptiste Lully, emphasized precision, grandeur, and ritualized elegance. In Germany, composers like Heinrich Schütz and later Bach blended Italian, French, and local traditions, creating a uniquely expressive national style. England produced Handel, whose operas and oratorios combined dramatic storytelling with rich, harmonic, and melodic invention. Performance practice during the Baroque was as important as composition. Musicians improvised ornaments, added expressive dynamics, and brought their own interpretation to written music. Audiences were accustomed to theatricality and spectacle. Music was not a backdrop, but a full-bodied experience, often integrated with dance, costume, and stagecraft. The Baroque also witnessed the rise of musical theory and treatises. Scholars such as Johann Joseph Fuchs codified counterpoint in works like Gradus ad Parnassum, shaping generations of composers. The period emphasized the study of harmony, rhythm, form, and the emotional impact of specific musical devices. Music was both an art and a science, discipline for the hands, the mind, and the spirit. By the end of the Baroque era, music had transformed dramatically from its Renaissance roots. It had become intensely expressive, technically sophisticated, and emotionally immersive. Yet composers had expanded the possibilities of melody, harmony, and rhythm. Instruments had evolved, orchestras had grown, and the stage had become a space for drama and storytelling. Music was no longer simply accompaniment or ritual. It was a multi-dimensional art form capable of encompassing the full range of human experience. The legacy of the Baroque would echo for centuries. Classical composers like Mozart and Haydn built upon its structures, while Romantic composers would push its expressive ideals to new extremes. But the essence of the Baroque's celebration of drama, its love of contrast, its fusion of intellect and emotion remains a cornerstone of Western music. Chapter 9. The Classical Era. Symmetry, Form, T. In the dawn of public concerts, the mid-18th century brought a seismic shift in Western music. The exuberance and ornamentation of the Baroque gave way to clarity, symmetry, and formal balance. This was the Classical Era, a period when music mirrored the Enlightenment's ideals: reason, proportion, and natural order. Composers sought elegance and simplicity, creating works that were immediately intelligible yet emotionally compelling. The focus shifted from overwhelming complexity to a carefully structured beauty that could both delight and move. Vienna emerged as the epicenter of classical music, attracting composers, performers, and audiences from across Europe. The city's thriving salons, aristocratic courts, and expanding public concert scene created fertile ground for innovation. Composers such as Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus, Mozart, and later Ludwig van Beethoven would define this era, forging new paths in symphonic, chamber, and vocal music. One of the most significant developments of the classical era was the symphony. Haydn, often called the father of the symphony, transformed the genre from a simple suite of dances into a sophisticated form with 4 movements, typically fast, low minuet, trio fast. These symphonies combined melodic elegance, harmonic clarity, and structural logic. They were intellectual and emotional journeys, balancing innovation with accessibility. Haydn's London symphonies epitomize the era's blend of wit, drama, and technical mastery. Mozart expanded these ideas further. His symphonies, operas, and chamber works elevated emotional expression without sacrificing structural clarity. In operas like The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, he combined lyrical beauty with psychological insight, portraying human emotion with unprecedented subtlety. Music became a mirror of society, reflecting character, motivation, and conflict. In every aria, every overture, Mozart's genius revealed itself in the seamless interplay of melody, harmony, and drama. The piano rose to prominence during this period, replacing the harpsichord as the central keyboard instrument. Its dynamic range and expressive capacity allowed composers to explore new textures and tonal contrasts. Keyboard sonatas became vehicles for personal expression, intellectual exploration, and virtuosic display. Beethoven, in particular, would later push the instrument's expressive potential to extremes, foreshadowing the Romantic era. Its chamber music, too, flourished, String quartets, piano trios, and wind ensembles became vehicles for experimentation, intimacy, and dialogue between instruments. Haydn's string quartets established a conversational model where each instrument had a distinct voice yet contributed to a cohesive whole. These small-scale works allowed composers to explore nuance, interplay, and subtlety that could be lost in a larger orchestral setting. The classical era also witnessed the birth of the public concert. No longer were performances confined to aristocratic courts or sacred spaces. Music became a shared cultural experience, accessible to the growing urban middle class. Concert halls, subscription series, and festivals allowed composers to reach broader audiences, democratizing music and laying the foundations for modern musical life. Audiences became active participants, shaping the development of repertoire and performance practice. Opera remained central to musical life, evolving toward opera, buffa, comic opera, and continuing the tradition of opera seria, serious opera. Comic operas, in particular, reflected social realities, poking fun at aristocracy, bureaucracy, and human folly. Mozart excelled in this genre, combining humor, melody, and dramatic truth. Opera in the classical era emphasized clear storytelling, memorable melodies, and expressive clarity. The orchestra became an active participant in drama, supporting, commenting, and interacting with vocal lines. Harmonic language in the classical era emphasized clarity and contrast. Composers relied on major and minor tonality, modulations, two closely related keys, and careful phrase structure. Melody became the dominant expressive tool, often symmetrical and balanced, with antecedent and consequent phrases. Harmony supported and enriched melody, creating tension and release in ways that were immediately perceptible to listeners. Rhythm and dynamics were treated with subtlety, whereas Baroque music often emphasized steady drive and continuous motion. Classical composers explored flexibility in tempo, contrast between soft and loud passages, and nuanced articulation. These choices allowed music to breathe, to surprise, and to emotionally engage audiences in ways that had previously been reserved for the human voice. The classical era also nurtured the development of musical forms that endure to this day. Sonata form, for example, became the backbone of symphonies, sonatas, and concertos. It established a dialogue between themes, development, and recapitulation, offering composers both structure and freedom. Their forms, minuets, rondos, variations, and fugues were adapted and refined, balancing predictability with invention. Beethoven, straddling the classical and romantic eras, would eventually push these forms to new limits. His early works embraced classical balance, but his middle and late periods introduced emotional intensity, dramatic contrasts, and harmonic daring that would inspire generations of composers. Symphony No. 3, Eurica, for example, expanded the scope of orchestral music, infusing it with heroic narrative and profound emotional depth. Beyond Europe, the classical era's ideals influenced global music in subtle ways. Instruments, scales, and forms spread through trade and colonization, interacting with local traditions. While these exchanges were uneven and often disruptive, they planted seeds for later syncretic forms in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Classical European music became a lingua franca of cultural aspiration, education, and social sophistication. Music education also flourished. Conservatories, salons, and private instruction disseminated the principles of classical style. Young musicians studied harmony, counterpoint, and performance with rigor, learning not only technical skills, but aesthetic sensibility. Composers themselves became teachers, critics, and theorists, contributing to a growing discourse on the purpose and meaning of music. In sum, the classical era represents a moment of formal elegance, expressive clarity, and cultural expansion. It bridged the intellectual rigor of the Baroque with the emotional and narrative potential that Romantic composers would later exploit. Music became more accessible, more emotionally nuanced, and more capable of reflecting both societal ideals and individual expression. The symphony, concerto, sonata, and opera achieved forms that would define Western music for centuries. Yet, even as Europe reveled in clarity, other regions of the world continued to develop rich musical traditions. The ragas of India, the Gurkeen melodies of China, and indigenous music in Africa and the Americas evolved independently, reflecting local philosophies, spiritual beliefs, and social structures. By the 18th century, music was not a singular European story. It was a global tapestry of expression, ritual, and human creativity, waiting for the next chapter of interconnection and evolution. Chapter 10. The Romantic Era. Passion, nationalism, and virtuosity. As the 19th century dawned, Europe was a continent in motion. Political revolutions, industrial expansion, and social upheaval created fertile ground for new artistic expression. Music, long shaped by formal clarity and balance, now sought to capture the full spectrum of human emotion: joy, despair, longing, heroism, and the ineffable. This was the Romantic Era, a time when composers prioritized feeling over structure, individuality over convention, and national identity over universal abstraction. The Romantic Era saw the rise of the composer as artist genius. No longer were composers merely servants of aristocracy or church. They were creative individuals, celebrated for their originality, emotional depth, and intellectual insight. Figures like Franz Schubert, Felix Mendelssohn, Robert Schumann, Frédéric Chopin, Hector Berlioz, Franz Liszt, and Richard Wagner transformed music into a vessel for personal expression, social commentary, and philosophical reflection. The audience no longer simply consumed music. They experienced the inner life of the composer through sound. Orchestras expanded, embracing larger numbers of instruments, wider ranges, and unprecedented sonic power. Romantic composers experimented with new timbres, novel instrumental combinations, and dramatic contrasts. The orchestra became a theater of emotion: strings weeping, brass exulting, woodwinds whispering secrets, percussion striking with theatrical intensity. Symphonies grew longer and more complex, often telling a story or exploring a theme. Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique exemplifies this, weaving a narrative of love, passion, and despair with orchestration that painted vivid emotional landscapes. The piano emerged as a central romantic instrument, both in private salons and concert halls. Composers like Chopin and Liszt expanded its expressive range, exploring new textures, harmonies, and virtuosic possibilities. Liszt's transcendental etudes and Chopin's nocturnes transformed the piano into a tool for both intimate expression and public spectacle. Music became both a personal diary and a public performance of emotional intensity. Nationalism shaped composition in unprecedented ways. Composers drew inspiration from folk songs, dances, and legends, infusing classical forms with local color. Bedřich Smetana in DVO in Bohemia, Edvard Grieg in Norway, and Mikhail Glinka in Russia crafted music that celebrated cultural identity. This period demonstrated that music was not merely entertainment or ritual. It could assert collective identity, resist oppression, and inspire political sentiment. Opera reached new, dramatic heights. Wagner's monumental works, with their leitmotifs, transformed operatic storytelling. Themes, representing characters, ideas, and emotions, recurred throughout epic dramas, creating a web of musical symbolism. Verdi, by contrast, fused lyrical beauty with theatrical intensity, producing operas like La Traviata and Aida, where human emotion and social conflict intertwined seamlessly. Romantic opera demanded not only virtuosity, but also profound dramatic interpretation. Virtuosity became a hallmark of the era. Musicians such as Paganini and Franz Liszt achieved near-mythical status, their technical prowess inspiring both awe and envy. Performers became celebrities, touring Europe and electrifying audiences with feats once thought impossible. This emphasis on technical brilliance was not merely spectacle, it was an expression of human potential, the romantic ideal of the individual transcending limits through skill and imagination. Harmonic language evolved dramatically. Romantic composers explored chromaticism, modulation, and unconventional tonal structures, heightening emotional tension and release. Beethoven's late works had opened the door to harmonic experimentation, and composers now pushed it further. Chromatic lines, unresolved dissonances, and distant key relationships allowed music to convey longing, instability, and ecstasy with unparalleled intensity. The Romantic era also saw the rise of programmed music instrumental works, explicitly linked to stories, poems, or ideas. Composers sought to translate narrative, scene, or emotion into sound. Berlioz, Liszt, and Smetana composed symphonic poems, orchestral works that functioned as sonic storytelling. The audience was invited into a universe of imagery, where music painted landscapes, recounted battles, caped, and traced the arc of human experience without a single word. Chamber music remained vital, but the Romantic approach emphasized expressive depth over formal restraint. String quartets, piano trios, and sonatas explored intimate emotion, contrasting the grandeur of orchestral and operatic works. Schumann's piano quintets and Brahms' chamber works revealed the romantic blend of lyricism, harmonic richness, and subtle interplay between instruments, demonstrating that passion could thrive even in smaller, private settings. The song, or lieder, became a vehicle for personal and poetic expression. Schubert and Schumann set poetry to music in ways that fused text and melody seamlessly. The piano accompaniment was not mere support, was a dialogue partner, evoking atmosphere, emotional nuance, and narrative detail. Lieder transformed the domestic music culture, turning parlors and salons into spaces of artistic intimacy, where listeners could experience emotion as both participant and witness. The 19th century also saw music spreading beyond Europe. Composers in Latin America, Asia, and Africa began to integrate European forms with local traditions, foreshadowing the globalized musical landscape of the 20th century. Indigenous rhythms, folk melodies, and native instruments enriched European-based structures, creating hybrid forms that expressed both local identity and universal aspiration. The Romantic era's influence persists today. Its emphasis on emotional intensity, individual expression, and national identity reshaped the purpose and potential of music. Composers proved that sound could communicate what words sometimes fail to express: the inner life, the collective experience, and the transcendence of human imagination. Music of this period was a bridge between worlds, private and public, local and universal, intellect and feeling. Romantic composers explored the extremes of emotion, expanded technical possibilities, and created narratives that resonated with audiences across generations. By the end of the 19th century, the stage was set for the next era, modernism, where tradition would collide with innovation, and music would once again redefine the boundaries of sound, identity, and meaning. Chapter 11: Music in the Modern Age. Impressionism. Expressionism is a birth of global sound, 1900 to 1950. As the 20th century dawned, the world was in flux. Industrialization, urbanization, and the pressures of political upheaval created both excitement and anxiety. Music, always a reflection of society, underwent profound transformations, breaking from romantic ideals while retaining emotional intensity. This era saw the rise of experimentation, abstraction, and the global expansion of musical consciousness, setting the stage for modern soundscapes. Impressionism, led by French composers like Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel, reimagined the way music could evoke imagery and sensation, unlike Romantic composers who expressed direct emotional narrative. Impressionists emphasized color, texture, and atmosphere. Debussy, his Clair de Lune, and L.D.N. used unconventional scales whole tone, pentatonic, modal and blurred traditional harmonic boundaries, creating a sound world that floated between dream and reality. Ravel expanded orchestral color with delicate instrumentation, layering sounds to evoke shimmering water, starlight, or exotic landscapes. Here, music became painting and sound, where subtle shifts in timbre and harmony suggested mood rather than explicit story. Expressionism emerged primarily in Germany and Austria, with composers like Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern reactionary against the lush, emotive, romantic style. They sought to penetrate the psyche, exploring raw, intense emotion through dissonance, atonality, and novel structures. Schoenberg developed the 12-tone technique, ensuring each of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale was treated equally, avoiding traditional tonal hierarchies. Works like Berg's Wazik conveyed human despair with piercing immediacy, while Webern's miniatures, almost microscopic in scale, distilled emotion into compact, intense gestures. Here, music was not comfort, but confrontation, challenging audiences to engage with emotion in its most elemental form. Across the Atlantic, the United States cultivated a uniquely American sound. Early 20th century composers drew from folk songs, spirituals, and jazz, creating hybrid forms that expressed both local identity and cosmopolitan influence. Charles Ives experimented with polytonality, layering multiple melodies and harmonies to reflect the complexity of modern life. George Gershwin bridged classical and popular styles, blending jazz rhythms with symphonic orchestration in Rhapsody in Blue, while Aaron Copland captured the wide open landscapes and frontier spirit of America in works like Appalachian Spring. Music became a mirror of national identity, forging cultural narratives distinct from Europe, yet conversant with its traditions. The early 20th century also witnessed the birth of global sound awareness. Colonialism, trade, and migration brought diverse musical traditions into contact. Composers like and collected folk music from Hungary and neighboring regions, integrating it into classical forms. African, Asian, and Latin American rhythms and scales began influencing Western composers, planting seeds for the later explosion of cross-cultural music. Music was no longer a strictly local art. It was a networked, dynamic phenomenon circulating across continents, shaping and reshaping identity. Technological innovations revolutionized the production and distribution of music. The phonograph, radio, and recording studios allowed music to be shared widely for the first time. For the first time, composers and performers could reach audiences across nations, democratizing access to works once confined to concert halls. Jazz, blues, and popular songs traveled across oceans, influencing classical and folk music alike. This era marks the first truly globalized musical consciousness, where sounds and styles migrated, collided, and hybridized in unprecedented ways. Modernism in music was not solely about abstraction or exoticism, was also about rethinking rhythm, structure, and timbre. Composers like Igor Stravinsky revolutionized rhythmic organization in The Rite of Spring, using complex, shifting meters to shock audiences and depict primal energy. Percussion became central, harmonies shifted unpredictably, and melodic expectations were subverted. The premiere famously caused a riot, symbolizing the profound cultural rupture modern music often provoked. Music was now a space of intellectual challenge, as well as emotional intensity. The period between the world wars was a time of intense experimentation. In Paris, the Les Six group comprising composers like Darius Milhaud and Francis Poulenc praised clarity, wit, and popular influence, resisting both the heavy Germanic tradition and the lush impressionism of Debussy. In Vienna, the Second Viennese School pushed boundaries of atonality and serialism. Across Europe, composers sought to reconcile tradition and innovation, creating works that challenged perception, expectation, and taste. Meanwhile, non-Western music began to influence modern composers more directly. Indian ragas, Balinese, gamelan, and African drumming inspired rhythmic, melodic, and timbral experimentation. Composers like Debussy and Messiaen integrated these global elements into their works, not as pastiche, but as sources of new musical logic and aesthetics. Music became a dialogue between cultures, an exploration of universality without erasing difference. World events shaped musical production profoundly. World War I and II forced composers to confront trauma, displacement, and political upheaval. Music became a vessel for memory, protest, and reflection. Shostakovich in the Soviet Union embedded veiled political commentary within symphonies, expressing both personal anguish and collective suffering. Benjamin Britten in England explored war's human cost through operas like Peter Grimes, portraying communities fractured by violence and moral complexity. Music was both witness and interpreter of history, translating catastrophe into form and sound. In parallel, popular music evolved rapidly, merging folk, blues, and early jazz into new idioms. Ragtime, swing, and blues influenced both performance and composition, reshaping audience expectations and paving the way for mass-mediated music. Composers like Gershwin, Ellington, and later Copland bridged high and low culture, integrating vernacular styles into concert music, blurring the boundaries between tradition, innovation, and accessibility. The modern age of music also foregrounded the psychological and philosophical dimensions of sound. Music was increasingly seen as a medium for exploring subconscious states, abstract concepts, and social commentary. Expressionist and avant-garde composers treated sound itself as a subject, examining texture, silence, timbre, and spatial placement. Every note, every pause became meaningful, reflecting a heightened awareness of music's capacity to shape perception and consciousness. By 1950, the stage was set for post-war experimentation. Electronic music, minimalism, and avant-garde movements would push the boundaries even further. But the foundation of the modern age experimentation, cross-cultural integration, exploration of emotion, technological expansion, remained the lens through which all subsequent music would be understood. In essence, the modern age demonstrated that music was no longer confined to beauty or narrative alone. It could question, challenge, celebrate, and provoke. It could travel across continents, connect communities, and carry memory and identity through the most turbulent periods of human history. Music became both mirror and engine of a rapidly changing world. An art form that could encompass tradition, innovation, and imagination all at once.